At the height of its power, the Bulgarian Empire stretched from the Black Sea to the Adriatic, and from the Carpathians to the Aegean. Few today remember that, for centuries, Bulgaria was one of the dominant forces in medieval Europe, a rival to Byzantium, a cradle of Slavic literacy, and a battleground for empires. But how did a group of steppe warriors and Slavic tribes create not one, but two powerful empires that shaped the political and cultural destiny of the Balkans? This is the story of the Bulgarian Empire, a 1,000-year saga of kings and khans, of conversions and crusades, of glory, decline, and resilience. It begins in the shadow of Rome, long before the idea of Bulgaria existed, and ends in the fires of Ottoman conquest. Along the way, it traverses shifting alliances, ideological transformations, golden ages of learning, and devastating wars. Long before the Bulgarian Empire took shape, the Balkan Peninsula was a crossroads of civilizations, cultures, and migrations. Its strategic position between Europe and Asia, between the Danube River and the Aegean Sea, made it both a gateway and a battleground for centuries. To understand how Bulgaria emerged in this space, we must first understand what came before. In ancient times, the region was inhabited by various Indo-European peoples, the most prominent of whom were the Thracians. The Thracians were not a unified nation, but rather a collection of tribes spread across what is now Bulgaria, northern Greece, and European Turkey. They were known for their rich mythology, elaborate burial practices, and warrior culture. Though often overshadowed by their Greek and Roman neighbors, the Thracians played a key role in regional history. Notably, Spartacus, the leader of the great slave revolt against Rome in the 1st century BCE, was of Thracian origin. By the 4th century BCE, much of the region had been influenced by the expansion of the Macedonian Empire under Philip II and his son, Alexander the Great. After Alexander's death, control of the Balkans shifted among various Hellenistic successors until the rising Roman Republic began asserting its dominance in the 2nd century BCE. Roman expansion into the Balkans was gradual but decisive. By the 1st century CE, the entire region was firmly under Roman control. Provinces such as Moesia, Thrace, and Dacia were established, and Roman roads, cities, and military camps became fixtures in the landscape. The city of Serdica, modern-day Sofia, became an important administrative center. Roman rule brought urbanization, Latin language influence, and new systems of governance, but it also reshaped the region's demographics. As Rome expanded, it recruited soldiers and settled veterans in the area, introducing new populations and cultural practices. However, Roman control did not mean stability. From the 3rd century onward, pressures on the empire's frontiers increased dramatically. Waves of so-called barbarian invasions, including those by Goths, Huns, and Avars, swept across the Danube and into the Balkans. In the year 476, the Western Roman Empire officially fell, leaving the Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, as the main imperial authority in the region. But the Byzantines struggled to maintain control. Among the most disruptive groups during this time were the Slavs. Originating from the Pripyat marshes in present-day Belarus and Ukraine, Slavic tribes began migrating southward in the 6th century. They moved into the Balkans in large numbers, often raiding Byzantine territories and settling in depopulated areas. Their spread was not a single wave, but rather a series of incursions and gradual migrations that lasted for decades. The Byzantines, unable to defend all their borders, often resorted to diplomacy, settlement policies, or simply tolerated the Slavic presence. As a result, by the 7th century, much of the Balkan interior had become Slavicized. Slavic languages, customs, and village-based communities became dominant across large areas of what had once been Romanized provinces. At the same time, another powerful force was taking shape to the northeast, the Bulgars. The Bulgars were a semi-nomadic Turkic-speaking people, believed to have originated near the Volga River. By the late 6th century, they had migrated westward and established several short-lived states, the most prominent being Old Great Bulgaria under Khan Krum. Old Great Bulgaria, founded in the early 7th century, was located north of the Black Sea in what is now southern Ukraine. It was a confederation of Bulgar tribes led by Khan Krum, who had likely been influenced by both steppe traditions and Byzantine diplomacy. Kubrat's realm was recognized by the Byzantine Empire, and he is often credited with uniting the Bulgars for the first time. However, after his death around the year 665, Old Great Bulgaria fragmented under pressure from the Khazars, a powerful steppe empire to the east. By the middle of the 7th century, the landscape of southeastern Europe was changing rapidly. The Roman Empire in the west had long since disappeared, and the Byzantine Empire was struggling to defend its vast borders. Slavic tribes had already spread deep into the Balkan interior, forming local communities and slowly changing the cultural and linguistic fabric of the region. Yet it would be the arrival of a new group, the Bulgars, under the leadership of Asparuh, that would permanently reshape the political map of the Balkans. Asparuh was one of the sons of Khan Krum, the ruler of Old Great Bulgaria, a federation of Bulgar tribes that had formed to the north of the Black Sea in the early 7th century. Following Kubrat's death, Old Great Bulgaria came under pressure from the expanding Khazar Khaganate. The Khazars, a powerful and militarized steppe state, launched repeated attacks that destabilized the Bulgar Confederation and forced its disintegration. In the face of this growing threat, Kubrat's sons each took their followers and migrated in different directions. One of them, Asparuh, chose to move southwest, away from the Khazar front, toward the Danube River. This decision would prove crucial to the founding of a new state. Asparuh and his group of Bulgars eventually reached the region known as the Ongal, located just north of the Danube Delta, in what is now part of modern-day Ukraine and Romania. This region was a swampy, marshy terrain that provided natural defensive advantages. There, Asparuh began building alliances with local Slavic tribes who had already settled in the area. Unlike the Khazars, who imposed control through military force, Asparuh offered leadership and cooperation, allowing the Slavs to maintain their local customs while joining a broader political and military alliance. This collaboration between the Bulgars and the Slavs marked a significant moment in the foundation of what would become the Bulgarian state. It showed early signs of what would be a defining feature of Bulgarian history, the blending of diverse cultures under shared governance. Around the year 680, the Byzantine Empire took notice of the growing Bulgar presence across the Danube. Emperor Constantine IV, seeking to reassert imperial authority in the region, led a military campaign to expel Asparuh's forces. His army crossed the Danube and advanced into the Ongal, but the campaign ended in failure. Asparuh's forces, aided by their Slavic allies and using the difficult terrain to their advantage, defeated the Byzantine army. During the campaign, the emperor himself suffered from health issues, possibly gout, and had to withdraw, which demoralized his troops and led to their eventual rout. This defeat had far-reaching consequences. In the following year, 681, Emperor Constantine IV signed a treaty with Asparuh. The treaty was, in effect, a recognition of the new Bulgar polity south of the Danube. The Byzantines agreed to pay tribute to the Bulgars, acknowledging their authority in the region. This agreement marks the official birth of the First Bulgarian Empire. Unlike many steppe-origin confederations that remained loosely organized, Asparuh began laying the foundations for a more permanent state. He established a capital near Pliska, in northeastern Bulgaria. The choice of location was strategic, close enough to defend the frontier, but also in a region that allowed for agricultural development and control over key routes through the Balkan mountains. The newly formed state was not ethnically homogeneous. It included not only the Bulgars, but also a large population of Slavs, who far outnumbered their Bulgar counterparts. The early structure of the state was based on military organization, with tribal leaders playing important roles in governance. But over time, the political system began to centralize. Asparuh's leadership set the tone for future rulers, who would continue to develop administrative institutions and legal frameworks. One of Asparuh's most notable achievements was unifying these diverse groups under a shared political identity. Though the Bulgars were initially a ruling minority, they did not attempt to dominate their Slavic allies by force. Instead, they built a cooperative relationship that allowed for the gradual merging of cultures, languages, and traditions. This cultural synthesis would eventually result in a unique Bulgarian identity, one that incorporated steppe, Slavic, and Christian Byzantine influences. Asparuh's reign, however, was not to last indefinitely. According to later sources, he continued to lead military campaigns to secure and expand the borders of the new state. He likely died in battle against the Khazars sometime in the late 7th century, perhaps around the year 688. Despite his death, the state he founded would endure and grow stronger under his successors. The foundation of the First Bulgarian Empire represented more than just the creation of a new political entity. It symbolized a shift in power in southeastern Europe. For the first time since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, a non-Roman, non-Greek power had established a durable state within the Balkans that could challenge Byzantine dominance. It also marked the beginning of a new cultural and political tradition in the region, one that would persist through centuries of change. Following the foundation of the First Bulgarian Empire by Asparuh in the late 7th century, the young state faced a critical period of transition. Asparuh had succeeded in securing a territory and establishing a fragile but promising alliance with local Slavic tribes. However, a new leader was needed to preserve and build upon these early gains. That leader would be Khan Tervel, Asparuh's son and one of the most important figures in early Bulgarian history. Khan Tervel assumed power at the beginning of the 8th century, a time of political turbulence across the Balkans and the wider Byzantine world. The Eastern Roman Empire was struggling with internal instability and external threats. The Arab Caliphate was expanding rapidly in the east, and the empire was dealing with repeated changes of emperors, often by military coups. For the young Bulgarian state, this chaos presented both risks and opportunities. Tervel quickly proved himself to be a capable and pragmatic ruler. One of his earliest and most consequential decisions was to involve Bulgaria in the internal affairs of the Byzantine Empire. Around the year 705, Tervel was approached by a deposed Byzantine emperor, Justinian II, who had been ousted from the throne and mutilated in the traditional manner used to prevent claimants from returning to power. Despite having his nose cut off, Justinian escaped exile and sought support to reclaim the imperial throne. Justinian promised Tervel a generous reward if he would assist in a military campaign to retake Constantinople. Tervel agreed, recognizing that backing a legitimate emperor could grant Bulgaria both wealth and legitimacy. The Bulgarian army, under Tervel's command, marched alongside Justinian's forces to the capital. In a surprise move, they breached the walls of Constantinople, allegedly through bribery or insider support, and helped Justinian regain the throne. In return for his assistance, Tervel was granted the title of Caesar by Justinian II, an honorific rarely given to a foreign ruler. He was also awarded lands in the Thracian region, along with valuable gifts and diplomatic recognition. This was a landmark moment. Not only did it demonstrate the military strength and political sophistication of the Bulgarians, but it also marked the first time a Bulgar ruler was formally recognized by the Byzantine court as a high-ranking ally. Tervel's military intervention and the rewards it brought significantly elevated Bulgaria's standing in the region. More importantly, it cemented the role of the Bulgarian state as a player in the power politics of the Eastern Roman Empire. Tervel's reign was no longer about mere survival, it was about strategic influence. However, the alliance with Justinian II did not last. After returning to power, Justinian's rule became increasingly unpopular and despotic. Within a few years, he was overthrown again, and new emperors took the throne. Tervel, ever pragmatic, adjusted his policies accordingly, focusing on consolidating Bulgaria's gains and defending its borders. In the years that followed, Bulgaria faced renewed threats from the Byzantines, especially under Emperor Theodosius III and later Emperor Leo III. These emperors, wary of Bulgaria's growing power and its territorial acquisitions in Thrace, launched military campaigns to reassert Byzantine control. But Tervel's army, experienced and confident from earlier victories, was able to repel these attacks. One of the most significant episodes of Tervel's reign came in the year 718 during the Second Arab Siege of Constantinople. The Umayyad Caliphate had launched a massive assault on the Byzantine capital, bringing a vast fleet and tens of thousands of troops. The siege lasted for over a year, placing enormous pressure on Emperor Leo III and the survival of the Byzantine Empire itself. It was during this siege that Tervel once again demonstrated his role as a decisive regional actor. Responding to Byzantine pleas for help, or perhaps acting in his own interest to prevent an Arab foothold in the Balkans, Tervel led a Bulgarian force to assist the defenders of Constantinople. According to Byzantine sources, his cavalry inflicted heavy losses on the Arab forces in Thrace, disrupting their supply lines and forcing them into retreat. The combined efforts of the Byzantines and Bulgarians, along with the famed Greek fire, ultimately led to the lifting of the siege. Tervel's intervention during this pivotal moment helped preserve the Byzantine Empire and prevented a dramatic shift in the balance of power in southeastern Europe. His contribution was recognized in contemporary and later Byzantine chronicles, which praised the Bulgars as saviors of Constantinople. This not only reinforced Bulgaria's diplomatic position, but also deepened the complex relationship between the two empires, rivals, allies, and adversaries all at once. Beyond foreign affairs, Tervel also played a crucial role in consolidating internal authority within Bulgaria. Although less is known about domestic policies during his reign, the survival and stability of the Bulgarian state suggests that he successfully maintained order among the various Bulgar and Slavic tribes. This was a delicate balance, as the Bulgars still held a privileged position in the military and administration, but the Slavs formed the majority of the population. Tervel's ability to hold this coalition together paved the way for future rulers to build a more unified national identity. By the early 9th century, the First Bulgarian Empire faced a turning point. The decades following the reign of Khan Tervel had not been calm or predictable. After his era of military success and diplomatic achievement, Bulgaria entered a period marked by internal instability, shifting alliances, and renewed pressure from the Byzantine Empire. Power changed hands rapidly among Bulgar leaders, and the unity that Asparuh and Tervel had worked to build began to weaken. It was a moment when the young empire could have fractured permanently. Instead, this turbulent era set the stage for the rise of one of Bulgaria's most formidable and transformative rulers, Khan Krum. The period between Tervel's rule and Krum's ascent is not well documented, but what is known suggests a time of political fragmentation. Several Khans came to power in short succession, and many struggled to maintain control over the Bulgar aristocracy and the diverse Slavic groups within the empire. The balance between the Bulgar elite, who maintained traditional steppe-style governance, and the Slavic communities, who favored their own local autonomy, required constant negotiation. When a ruler was weak or unable to command authority, rival factions rose quickly, leading to instability. Externally, the Byzantine Empire remained both a threat and an unpredictable neighbor. Although the Byzantines had depended on Bulgarian assistance in earlier crises, they still regarded Bulgaria as a rival power that needed to be contained. At times, Byzantine emperors attempted to exploit internal divisions in Bulgaria by supporting rival claimants or encouraging local rebellions. These efforts created further uncertainty within the empire. It was in this atmosphere of political fragility that Krum emerged as a leader. His exact origins are debated, but many historians believe he may have belonged to a prominent Bulgar clan that gained influence through military success. Krum assumed power around the end of the 8th century, or the very beginning of the 9th, at a moment when the empire urgently needed strong leadership. Krum began his rule by stabilizing internal authority. One of his priority tasks was reasserting the power of the central government over the various Bulgar tribes and Slavic communities. To achieve this, he relied on a combination of military strength, administrative discipline, and the promise of stability. These early steps allowed him to solidify his position and prepare the empire for the challenges ahead. One of Krum's first major achievements was the defeat of the Avars, a once powerful steppe confederation that had dominated the Carpathian region for centuries. By the time of Krum's rise, the Avars were in decline, weakened by internal conflicts and external pressures. Recognizing an opportunity, Krum launched a series of campaigns against them. The Bulgarians successfully destroyed the remnants of the Avar Khaganate, incorporating their lands and absorbing valuable resources. This victory not only expanded Bulgarian territory, but also brought prestige and wealth to the empire. It was an important step in strengthening Bulgaria's regional position. Krum's greatest significance, however, lies in his confrontations with the Byzantine Empire. A major conflict erupted after a series of border disputes and skirmishes escalated into open warfare. In the early 9th century, Byzantine forces under Emperor Nikephoros I advanced deep into Bulgarian territory. Nikephoros, known for his aggressive policies, sought to deal a decisive blow to Bulgaria and end its growing influence. His army marched toward the Bulgarian capital of Pliska, capturing and plundering the city. However, the campaign soon turned disastrous for the Byzantines. As Nikephoros withdrew from Pliska, Krum organized a rapid and well-coordinated counterattack. Utilizing his knowledge of the terrain and the mobility of Bulgar cavalry, he set an ambush in the passes of the Balkan mountains. The Byzantine army was caught by surprise. The ensuing battle, often referred to as the Battle of the Varbitsa Pass, resulted in a catastrophic defeat for the Byzantines. Emperor Nikephoros I was killed, one of the very few Byzantine emperors to die in battle against a foreign force. Krum's victory at the Varbitsa Pass had profound consequences. It not only demonstrated the military strength of Bulgaria, but also marked a psychological turning point in its rivalry with the Byzantines. For centuries, the Byzantines had seen themselves as the dominant power in southeastern Europe, heirs to the Roman Empire. Now, they had suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of a kingdom they once viewed as a frontier threat. Krum's success signaled that Bulgaria was now a major regional power. The death of Nikephoros I created a power vacuum in Constantinople and led to further instability within the Byzantine Empire. Krum took advantage of this moment, continuing his campaigns and securing additional territories. His forces captured important forts and towns, pushing the frontier southward and increasing Bulgarian influence in Thrace. Even as new Byzantine emperors attempted to negotiate or counterattack, Krum maintained the upper hand. Yet Krum's impact extended beyond military achievements. He is also remembered for initiating one of the earliest known legal codes in Bulgarian history. According to Byzantine chroniclers, Krum introduced laws designed to strengthen social order, reduce crime, and promote stability. These laws reportedly addressed issues such as theft, perjury, and drinking habits, and sought to protect the poor from exploitation. Although historians debate the exact nature and scope of these laws, their introduction reflects Krum's effort to centralize authority and create a more cohesive society. In the context of early medieval Europe, where legal systems were often based on custom or tribal tradition, Krum's initiative stands out as a meaningful step toward organized governance. By establishing legal standards, Krum aimed to integrate the various communities within the empire, both Bulgar and Slavic, and encourage loyalty to the central state. Krum also invested in fortifications and administrative infrastructure. He strengthened border defenses, improved the organization of the army, and laid foundations for more systematic governance. These efforts contributed to the long-term stability and expansion of the empire under his successors. One of the most dramatic episodes of Krum's reign occurred during the siege of Constantinople itself. After several years of conflict and repeated successes against the Byzantines, Krum began preparing for a major assault on the imperial capital. His forces raided the outskirts of the city and conducted siege preparations. Byzantine sources describe Krum appearing before the walls in full ceremonial armor, performing rituals meant to intimidate the defenders. Although he never successfully breached the Theodosian walls, The very fact that he threatened Constantinople underscored the rising power of Bulgaria. When Khan Krum died in the early 9th century, he left behind a stronger, more centralized Bulgarian state. His campaigns had expanded Bulgaria's borders, and his efforts to create legal order had laid a foundation for governance. Yet, the state still faced critical questions: how to maintain this expanded territory, how to integrate its diverse population, and how to govern without constant war. The man who took on this task was his son, Omurtag. Omurtag came to power around the year 814. His reign marked a decisive shift in focus from conquest to consolidation. Where Krum had been a warrior king, Omurtag would become known as an administrator and builder. His policies would solidify the structure of the Bulgarian state, develop its infrastructure, and define its borders with greater clarity. The first years of Omurtag's rule were shaped by the need to stabilize the empire after the intensity of Krum's campaigns. Relations with the Byzantine Empire remained tense. However, Omurtag recognized that continued warfare would exhaust the state's resources and endanger internal cohesion. Therefore, one of his first major acts as ruler was to negotiate peace with Byzantium. In the year 815, Bulgaria and the Byzantine Empire signed a 30-year peace treaty. This agreement established fixed borders and allowed both empires to focus on internal affairs. The treaty was not merely a pause in hostilities. It marked the beginning of a period of relative peace in the Balkans, which allowed both states to recover and strengthen. The peace treaty also gave Bulgaria the breathing room it needed to transition from military dominance to administrative stability. Omurtag used this time to invest in the empire's infrastructure. He launched a large-scale construction program, building fortresses, administrative buildings, bridges, and palaces. One of the most famous of these was the reconstruction and expansion of Pliska, the capital city. Under Omurtag, Pliska was transformed from a primarily wooden settlement into a stone-built administrative and cultural center. Archaeological evidence reveals a complex of palaces, baths, and monumental buildings that reflected the increasing sophistication of the Bulgarian state. Inscriptions from Omurtag's reign, often carved in stone and written in Greek, offer valuable insights into his administration and worldview. These inscriptions refer to the construction of buildings and bridges, the placement of border markers, and even philosophical reflections on the impermanence of life. One well-known inscription reads, "Even if a man lives well, he dies, and another one comes into existence. Let the one who comes later upon seeing this inscription remember the one who had made it." These inscriptions demonstrate that Omurtag was not only a ruler concerned with power, but also with legacy. His emphasis on construction and record-keeping reflects a desire to create a lasting, organized state that would endure beyond his lifetime. Another crucial aspect of Omurtag's rule was the reorganization of the empire's internal administration. He divided the state into provinces known as comitati, each governed by a local official loyal to the central government. This system allowed for more efficient tax collection, military recruitment, and enforcement of laws. By formalizing administrative divisions, Omurtag reduced the autonomy of local tribal leaders and increased the central authority of the Khan. At the same time, Omurtag continued the policy of balancing power between the Bulgars and the Slavic population. He worked to integrate Slavic elites into the state structure, though the highest levels of power remained in the hands of the Bulgar nobility. This careful balancing act helped maintain internal stability and prevented large-scale revolts. Omurtag's reign also witnessed diplomatic and military engagement on the empire's western frontiers. In the region of Pannonia, located in present-day Hungary and Serbia, Bulgaria came into conflict with the expanding Frankish Empire under Emperor Louis the Pious, the son of Charlemagne. The Bulgars supported Slavic groups resisting Frankish control, while the Franks attempted to exert their own influence over these territories. Although the conflict did not escalate into full-scale war between the two empires, it showed that Omurtag was attentive to the balance of power across the Balkans. His involvement in the West was calculated, intended to protect Bulgaria's sphere of influence without overextending its military resources. Religious policy under Omurtag remained consistent with that of earlier rulers. Bulgaria was still a pagan state at this time, and the ruling elite followed traditional Tengrist practices inherited from the steppe. However, Christianity was present within the empire, especially in the form of Byzantine missionaries and Christian captives taken during earlier wars. Omurtag, determined to maintain control and unity, often acted harshly against Christian influence at the court. According to some Byzantine sources, he persecuted Christians within Bulgaria, particularly those among the Bulgar elite who had converted. This opposition to Christianity was not necessarily theological, but political. Omurtag viewed Christianity as a foreign ideology that could undermine the authority of the state and create divisions within the ruling class. His successors would inherit this delicate religious question, and it would become one of the central challenges of the next generation. By the middle of the 9th century, the First Bulgarian Empire had developed into a powerful and well-administered state. The reigns of Krum and Omurtag had brought military success and institutional strength, but the religious identity of the empire remained a divisive and unresolved issue. While the Bulgars, particularly the ruling elite, continued to follow traditional pagan beliefs rooted in Tengriism, the growing influence of Christianity among the Slavic population and Byzantine captives could no longer be ignored. The moment had come for Bulgaria to confront the most significant transformation in its early history, a shift that would alter its culture, diplomacy, and place in the world. This transformation came under the rule of Khan Boris, later known as Boris I. Boris, the son of Omurtag's successor Preslav, assumed power in the early to mid-9th century during a period of increasing pressure from both political and religious fronts. Byzantium, though weakened at times, remained a powerful neighbor and was the primary source of Orthodox Christianity in the region. To the west, the Frankish Empire, under the Carolingians, supported Latin Christianity through Rome. Bulgaria, situated between these two spheres of influence, found itself caught in a growing religious rivalry. Internally, the situation was also becoming complicated. As Christianity spread throughout the empire, especially among Slavic communities and Byzantine captives, it created a growing class of converts who were loyal to a different religious and cultural framework than the traditional Bulgar nobility. For Boris, maintaining unity among the empire's various peoples, Bulgars, Slavs, and others, was becoming increasingly difficult under the existing pagan belief system, which lacked a strong unifying ideological structure. The question of religion thus became a matter of statecraft. Boris understood that adopting a universal faith could strengthen internal cohesion, legitimize his rule, and open the door to diplomatic recognition from powerful Christian neighbors. However, the decision of which version of Christianity to adopt, Orthodox from Constantinople or Latin from Rome, would carry profound geopolitical consequences. Boris began to explore both options through diplomacy. He sent envoys to both the Byzantine court and the papacy, seeking advice and clarification on doctrine and political implications. This diplomatic balancing act was not just theological. It was a calculated attempt to secure the best possible terms for Bulgaria's entry into the Christian world. Ultimately, the Byzantine option gained the upper hand. According to several Byzantine sources, a combination of military pressure and religious negotiation brought Boris closer to Constantinople. One account suggests that Byzantine forces threatened Bulgaria's southern borders, forcing Boris to agree to terms that included baptism under the Orthodox rite. However, this version may oversimplify what was likely a more complex set of decisions. In the year approximately 865, Boris was baptized in the Orthodox Christian tradition, taking the name Michael in honor of Emperor Michael III. This marked the official Christianization of Bulgaria. While some elements of the court viewed the conversion with suspicion or hostility, Boris moved quickly to consolidate his new religious policy. The Christianization of Bulgaria was not a simple act of personal faith, it was a sweeping transformation of the state. Boris ordered the destruction of pagan idols and the establishment of Christian churches throughout the empire. He began reorganizing the social and political hierarchy around the new faith, promoting Christian clergy, and enforcing Christian morals and practices. Importantly, he worked to ensure that the new religion would not be seen as foreign domination, but as a Bulgarian institution. To achieve this, Boris sought to create an independent Bulgarian church. He initially turned to the Pope in Rome, hoping that by aligning with the papacy, Bulgaria might receive its own archbishop and clergy who would operate independently of both Rome and Constantinople. Pope Nicholas I responded with a lengthy set of letters answering Boris's questions on Christian doctrine and moral behavior, but Rome was ultimately reluctant to grant full autonomy to the Bulgarian Church. Frustrated with the papacy's hesitancy, Boris turned back to Constantinople. In a strategic move during the Eighth Ecumenical Council held in Constantinople in the year 869, the Byzantines agreed to the creation of an autonomous Bulgarian archbishopric. Although the Bulgarian Church would remain under the authority of the Ecumenical Patriarch in Constantinople for the time being, this agreement gave Boris a degree of control over religious life in his empire. The establishment of a national church played a critical role in rooting Christianity within Bulgarian society. Over time, this church would evolve into an autocephalous institution with its own leadership and cultural traditions. The introduction of Christianity also brought with it a written script, which would be further developed by disciples of Saints Cyril and Methodius, pioneers of Slavic literacy. However, Boris's reforms did not go unchallenged. Many members of the Bulgar nobility resisted the changes, viewing Christianity as a threat to traditional power structures and cultural identity. In one of the most dramatic moments of his reign, Boris was forced to suppress a rebellion by pagan nobles. According to historical sources, he ordered the execution of dozens of leading aristocrats who had opposed Christianization. This brutal episode demonstrated the seriousness of his commitment and the stakes involved in the religious transformation. Despite this internal resistance, Boris's policies succeeded in reshaping the Bulgarian state. Over time, Christian institutions became woven into the fabric of everyday life. Monasteries were built, religious texts translated, and church councils convened. The Bulgarian elite began to adopt Christian customs, names, and rituals. More importantly, a new sense of national identity began to emerge, one that integrated Slavic language and culture with Orthodox faith and imperial governance. As Bulgaria transitioned into a Christian state under Boris I, a profound cultural transformation began to unfold. The Christianization of the empire was not merely a change in faith, but a catalyst for intellectual and linguistic development. The success of the new religion and the unification of the state depended heavily on communication and education in a language people could understand. This necessity would soon bring about one of the most enduring cultural achievements in medieval Europe, the development and spread of a Slavic written language. At the center of this revolution were two Byzantine brothers from Thessalonica, Cyril and Methodius. Cyril, originally named Constantine, and his older brother Methodius, were born in the early 9th century into a well-educated family. Though of Greek heritage, the brothers grew up in a region with a significant Slavic-speaking population and became fluent in the local Slavic dialects. This linguistic and cultural familiarity made them ideal candidates for missionary work among the Slavic peoples. Their journey as missionaries began when the Byzantine emperor and the Patriarch of Constantinople commissioned them to travel to Great Moravia, a Slavic state in Central Europe, in response to a request from its ruler for teachers who could instruct the population in Christianity in their own language. Recognizing the challenges posed by converting a people without a written language, Cyril and Methodius set out to create a script that could capture the sounds of Slavic speech. The result was the Glagolitic alphabet, the first known written script designed specifically for the Slavic language. Though complex in appearance, it allowed for the translation of liturgical texts into Old Church Slavonic, a standardized literary language based on the Slavic dialects spoken around Thessalonica. This monumental achievement enabled the brothers to preach, teach, and conduct Christian services in a language the people could understand, greatly enhancing the spread and depth of Christian instruction. The innovation of the Glagolitic script had far-reaching consequences. By making religious texts accessible Cyril and Methodius not only facilitated religious conversion, but also laid the groundwork for a broader literary culture among the Slavs. Their translations included the Gospels, the Psalter, and parts of the liturgy, providing the foundation for a Slavic Christian tradition distinct from both Latin and Greek influences. However, their success was not without resistance. In Great Moravia and other areas under Frankish influence, Latin clergy viewed the use of the Slavic language in liturgy with suspicion. The Latin Church insisted on the use of Latin, Greek, or Hebrew, considered the three sacred languages of Christianity. Cyril and Methodius defended their work before the papacy in Rome, and were granted temporary approval to continue using the Slavic language, but their mission was ultimately curtailed by political and ecclesiastical opposition. Cyril died in Rome shortly after their defense, while Methodius returned to Central Europe and continued the work until his own death. After Methodius passed away, his students faced persecution and were expelled from Moravia. This could have marked the end of their work, but it did not. The expelled disciples, including Clement of Ohrid and Naum of Preslav, found refuge in Bulgaria, where their efforts were welcomed by Tsar Boris I and later his son Simeon. Bulgaria, now officially Christian, saw in these scholars a chance to solidify the faith and strengthen the cultural independence of the state. Boris recognized the potential of a Slavic liturgy to unify the population, elevate national identity, and reduce dependence on Greek-speaking clergy from Constantinople. In Bulgaria, the disciples of Cyril and Methodius began the next phase of their work. While the Glagolitic script continued to be used in some regions, a new script was developed, simpler and better suited for writing on parchment. This new script was called Cyrillic, in honor of Cyril, although it was most likely created by his followers. The Cyrillic alphabet was based partly on the Greek script, but adapted to accommodate Slavic phonetics. It quickly became the primary tool for writing in Old Church Slavonic. The creation and institutionalization of the Cyrillic alphabet in Bulgaria gave rise to a powerful literary and scholarly tradition. Under the patronage of the Bulgarian court, two major centers of learning were established: the Ohrid Literary School in the southwest and the Preslav Literary School in the northeast. These institutions became hubs of religious education, translation, and original writing, producing sermons, chronicles, theological treatises, and hymnography. The adoption of a Slavic literary language and script had profound consequences for Bulgarian society. It enabled the training of native clergy, reduced the influence of Greek-speaking ecclesiastical authorities, and contributed to a distinctly Bulgarian form of Christianity. Over time, this literary tradition would spread to other Slavic lands, including Serbia and Kievan Rus, profoundly shaping the religious and cultural development of Eastern Europe. The work of Clement of Ohrid deserves special recognition. He not only taught hundreds of students but also wrote some of the earliest original works in Old Church Slavonic. He is often considered the first Slavic author, and his efforts helped establish a shared cultural identity rooted in language and faith. Likewise, Naum's contributions to education and monastic life further reinforced the role of the church and literacy in Bulgarian public life. Through the efforts of these scholars, the Slavic language gained not only religious but also political legitimacy. The use of Old Church Slavonic in state administration, inscriptions, and diplomatic communication marked a significant step in the formation of a national consciousness. Bulgaria was no longer just a geopolitical entity. It had become a cultural force with its own voice, faith, and literary heritage. With the groundwork laid by Boris I and the cultural revolution driven by the disciples of Cyril and Methodius, Bulgaria entered the 10th century prepared for a new phase of development. This phase would be marked not only by religious and cultural consolidation, but also by the ambitious expansion of political and military power. At the center of this transformation stood Tsar Simeon, later known as Simeon the Great. His reign would bring the First Bulgarian Empire to its zenith, earning Bulgaria a place among the most powerful and culturally influential states in medieval Europe. Simeon was the third son of Boris I. Initially, he was not meant to rule. As part of Boris's broader Christianization policy, Simeon was sent to Constantinople to receive a Byzantine education intended for a future ecclesiastical career. There, he studied at the prestigious Magnora school, where he became fluent in Greek and steeped in Byzantine philosophy, theology, and literature. This education would shape Simeon into one of the most intellectually sophisticated monarchs of his time. His classical training in Constantinople gave him not only a deep appreciation of culture and learning, but also a strategic understanding of the Byzantine world. However, the course of Simeon's life changed when his elder brother Vladimir, who succeeded Boris, attempted to restore paganism. As previously mentioned, Boris intervened, deposed Vladimir, and brought Simeon back from monastic preparation to place him on the throne. In doing so, Boris ensured that the Christian path for Bulgaria would continue under capable leadership. Simeon came to power around the year 893. Almost immediately, he was drawn into conflict with the Byzantine Empire. The origins of this conflict were not primarily religious, but economic. The Byzantines had recently moved the Bulgarian trade market from Constantinople to Thessalonica, placing new tariffs and restricting Bulgarian merchants. This economic provocation was seen as a direct challenge to Bulgarian interests and a calculated attempt to weaken the empire. Simeon responded with war. The First Bulgarian-Byzantine War broke out in the early years of his reign and would span multiple decades. Early battles were favorable to the Bulgarians. At the Battle of Bulgarophygon, Bulgarian forces inflicted a heavy defeat on the Byzantines. As a result, Simeon managed to extract favorable peace terms, including the restoration of trade rights and tribute payments from Byzantium. Yet, this was only the beginning. Simeon viewed himself not merely as a king defending his borders, but as a rival claimant to imperial authority in the region. His vision was to transform Bulgaria into a cultural and political equal of Constantinople, or even its successor. Over time, he began to refer to himself as Emperor of the Bulgarians, and later Emperor of the Bulgarians and Romans, asserting a direct challenge to the Byzantine emperor's authority. Simeon's aspirations were reflected not only in his military campaigns, but also in his court culture. Under his reign, Bulgaria experienced a remarkable cultural flourishing, often referred to as the Golden Age of Bulgarian culture. The Preslav literary school, which had been established earlier, reached new heights. Scholars translated major theological and philosophical texts into Old Church Slavonic. Original literary works, sermons, and historical chronicles were composed. The Cyrillic alphabet, developed in Bulgaria, was fully institutionalized as the written script of the empire. This era witnessed the emergence of notable writers such as John the Exarch, Constantine of Preslav, and Chernorizets Hrabar. These figures contributed to a distinctive Slavic Christian literature that not only reinforced religious instruction, but also promoted a strong sense of national identity. The Preslav Literary School became one of the leading centers of Orthodox learning in the Slavic world, rivaled only by Constantinople itself. Simeon's military campaigns continued through the first half of the 10th century. In addition to Byzantium, he fought wars with Hungary and Serbia. His conflict with Serbia was particularly notable. Initially allies, the Serbs shifted allegiance to Byzantium, provoking Simeon's intervention. He responded with a campaign that resulted in the capture and annexation of the Serbian state in the year 925. Though short-lived, this expansion demonstrated Bulgaria's regional dominance. Simeon's relationship with Byzantium remained hostile for most of his reign. At several points, he came close to taking Constantinople. One of the most ambitious moments came in the year 913, when a Byzantine delegation met Simeon outside the capital and addressed him as emperor. Though this was likely a diplomatic concession rather than formal recognition, Simeon interpreted it as validation of his imperial status. Despite his military successes, Simeon never managed to capture Constantinople. His ambitions were repeatedly thwarted by shifting alliances, Byzantine diplomacy, and unexpected developments. The Byzantines, skilled in intrigue, often used diplomacy to delay Bulgarian advances. They formed alliances with other powers, including the Magyars and the Pechenegs, to harass Bulgaria from the north. These indirect attacks forced Simeon to divert resources and attention away from his campaigns against Byzantium. One of Simeon's most enduring legacies was the transformation of the Bulgarian monarchy. He was the first Bulgarian ruler to adopt the title Tsar, derived from Caesar, signifying emperor. This change was more than symbolic. It represented a fundamental shift in how Bulgaria saw itself. Under Simeon, Bulgaria was no longer a regional power on the periphery of Byzantium. It was a sovereign empire with its own religious institutions, cultural identity, and political ideology. The capital city of Preslav was rebuilt and beautified to reflect this imperial ambition. The architectural style of new buildings blended Slavic, Byzantine, and steppe elements, and the city became a symbol of Bulgaria's growing confidence. Churches, royal palaces, and literary schools demonstrated that Bulgaria was no longer culturally dependent on Constantinople. In many ways, Simeon's reign marked the high point of the First Bulgarian Empire. By the time of his death around the year 927, Bulgaria's territory stretched from the Adriatic Sea in the west to the Black Sea in the east, and from the Carpathian Mountains in the north to the Aegean Sea in the south. It was one of the largest and most powerful states in Europe. The death of Simeon the Great in the year approximately 927 marked a dramatic shift in the trajectory of the First Bulgarian Empire. Under Simeon's long and ambitious reign, Bulgaria had grown into a major European power, territorially expansive, culturally vibrant, and politically assertive. However, maintaining such an empire required not only vision, but continued discipline, unity, and capable leadership. With Simeon's passing, the strength that had propelled Bulgaria forward began to erode. His successors inherited a mighty state, but lacked the same strategic genius and force of character. The consequences would soon become clear. Simeon was succeeded by his son, Peter I, who took the throne at a time when the empire appeared to be at its height. Yet, appearances were deceptive. Simeon had left Bulgaria in a constant state of military mobilization, surrounded by hostile or uneasy neighbors, and dependent on centralized authority to hold together its vast and diverse territories. The transition to Peter's rule was peaceful, thanks in part to the arrangements made by Simeon before his death. But Peter quickly faced the challenge of governing an empire in peacetime that had been shaped by decades of warfare. One of Peter's first priorities was to stabilize relations with Byzantium. After years of almost unbroken conflict, the new emperor negotiated a peace treaty with the Byzantine court, which included the recognition of his title as Tsar and his marriage to the Byzantine princess Maria, granddaughter of Emperor Romanos I Lekapenos. This dynastic marriage was a landmark in Bulgarian-Byzantine relations and signaled a new phase of diplomacy between the two empires. Peter's policy of peace brought a temporary calm to Bulgaria's southern frontier and allowed him to focus on internal matters. However, this period of peace also revealed underlying weaknesses in the Bulgarian state. The strong centralized control that Simeon had maintained began to loosen. Local nobles and regional governors, known as boyars, started to assert greater autonomy. The balance between the central court in Preslav and the provincial aristocracy began to tilt in favor of the latter. Compounding this political decentralization were external pressures. From the north and northeast, new threats emerged in the form of the Magyars and the Pechenegs, semi-nomadic peoples who raided and disrupted the northern regions of the Bulgarian Empire. The Pechenegs, in particular, launched repeated attacks along the Danube frontier, forcing Bulgaria into defensive actions and straining its military resources. At the same time, the empire began to experience internal spiritual and social unrest. Although Peter I supported the Bulgarian Orthodox Church and continued the tradition of patronage begun by his father, He was also confronted by new religious movements that criticized the church's growing wealth and closeness to political power. Chief among these movements was the Bogomil heresy. The Bogomils, named after their supposed founder, the priest Bogomil, preached a dualistic belief system that rejected the material world as evil and condemned the established church as corrupt. They called for a return to a pure and simple faith, free from institutional control. The movement found support among the rural poor and disaffected segments of society who felt excluded from the growing opulence of the church and the aristocracy. While Peter attempted to suppress the Bogomils, their teachings spread rapidly throughout Bulgaria and later into other Slavic lands, including Serbia and Bosnia. The rise of this heresy signaled deeper social tensions and a weakening of the ideological unity that had once reinforced the authority of the state. Meanwhile, in the West, the newly formed Kingdom of Croatia and the expanding Serbian principalities began to assert their independence and resist Bulgarian influence. The complex Balkan landscape, once dominated by Bulgarian power, was beginning to fragment. Efforts to maintain control over these territories were increasingly difficult, especially with the growing assertiveness of regional leaders. Perhaps most significantly, the economic situation in Bulgaria began to decline. The long wars of Simeon's era had placed a heavy burden on the population, and the shift to a more peaceful but decentralized system under Peter meant that tax collection and public administration suffered. The central treasury struggled to fund military defense, infrastructure, and church institutions at the same levels seen under earlier rulers. In the midst of these challenges, Peter's reign endured for more than 4 decades. A remarkably long tenure by medieval standards. He is remembered as a pious and modest ruler, but also as one who was unable to arrest the slow weakening of the Bulgarian state. His death around the year 969 marked the end of a relatively stable but gradually declining period. Following Peter's passing, the empire entered a far more volatile era. His son Boris II succeeded him but quickly proved unable to control the growing disorder. During his brief rule, Bulgaria was invaded by the Kievan Rus under Prince Sviatoslav, who exploited internal divisions and Byzantine encouragement to launch a campaign deep into Bulgarian territory. Sviatoslav captured Preslav and established control over much of northeastern Bulgaria. The Kievan intervention introduced a new and destabilizing force into Balkan politics. Sviatoslav envisioned creating a Rus-controlled empire in the Balkans, using Bulgaria as a base. However, his ambitions alarmed the Byzantines, who had initially welcomed his attacks on Bulgaria. They soon turned against him and defeated his forces. In the aftermath, the Byzantine Empire annexed eastern Bulgaria, including the capital, and took Boris II into custody. As the eastern provinces of Bulgaria fell under Byzantine control in the late 10th century, the once mighty First Bulgarian Empire appeared to be crumbling. Its capital had been taken, its Tsar, Boris II, captured, and its eastern territories annexed. Yet, in the mountainous west, particularly in the regions of Macedonia and along the shores of Lake Ohrid, resistance continued. Here, in the rugged landscape far from the reach of Constantinople's bureaucracy, a new center of Bulgarian power began to form. Led by a family of regional noblemen known as the Kometopuli. The Kometopuli, meaning sons of the Count, were 4 brothers, David, Moses, Aaron, and Samuel, who emerged as military and political leaders during the final years of the 10th century. Of these, it was Samuel who would rise to dominate and become the new face of Bulgarian resistance. Unlike the court-centered kings of the past, Samuel built his power on military leadership, local alliances, and relentless warfare. His struggle to restore Bulgaria's independence would define the final chapter of the First Bulgarian Empire. By the time Samuel assumed full control, following the deaths of his brothers in various battles and intrigues, he had already proven himself a capable commander. Operating from western strongholds like Prespa and later Ohrid, Samuel launched counteroffensives against both Byzantine forces and their allies, reclaiming large swaths of territory across the Balkans. Under his leadership, Bulgarian forces retook much of Macedonia, Thessaly, and parts of modern-day Albania and Serbia. Samuel's rise coincided with a period of internal instability in Byzantium, which gave him breathing room to rebuild. However, once Emperor Basil II secured power in Constantinople, the full might of the Eastern Roman Empire would turn once again toward Bulgaria. Basil II, a determined and capable ruler, would dedicate much of his long reign to the destruction of Samuel's state, a campaign that would become one of the most intense and enduring military struggles of the medieval Balkans. Basil's efforts to subdue Bulgaria began in earnest in the final decade of the 10th century. At first, progress was slow. Samuel's forces used the terrain to their advantage, engaging in guerrilla warfare, ambushing Byzantine troops in narrow passes, and avoiding direct confrontation. His strategy was one of attrition, relying on mobility and surprise. For years, Samuel's tactics kept the Byzantines from establishing permanent control over the western territories. Despite these successes, Samuel's empire was increasingly under pressure. Though he crowned himself Tsar and moved the patriarchal seat to Ohrid, creating a sense of continuity with the old Bulgarian Empire, the political and cultural center of gravity had shifted. The new state was less centralized and more dependent on military campaigns to sustain legitimacy. Its administrative institutions, once so developed under rulers like Omurtag and Simeon, were now fragmented. The decisive turn in the struggle came in the early 11th century. Basil II, having secured his empire internally and repelled external threats from the east, launched a series of campaigns designed to break Bulgarian resistance for good. He reorganized his military, constructed fortresses to secure conquered areas, and ensured a steady supply line into the Balkans. His approach was methodical and persistent. The tide began to shift after the year 1001, when Basil captured several key cities, including Skopje and Plovdiv. These victories cut off Samuel's communication lines and divided his realm. Though Samuel continued to resist, the Byzantines now controlled important strategic points and were able to strike deeper into the Bulgarian interior. The most significant and symbolic blow came in the year 1014 at the Battle of Kaloyan. Here, Basil II outmaneuvered the Bulgarian forces by using a flanking attack to trap Samuel's army in a mountain pass. The result was catastrophic. Thousands of Bulgarian soldiers were captured. What followed became one of the most infamous acts in Byzantine military history. According to contemporary chroniclers, Basil II ordered that the captured soldiers be blinded. Every group of 100 men left with a single man bearing one eye to lead the others home. When the maimed soldiers returned to Samuel, the sight was so horrifying that he suffered a stroke and died shortly thereafter. Though some modern historians question the scale of the blinding, there is little doubt about its impact. Basil earned the nickname Bulgar Slayer, and the psychological blow to the Bulgarian resistance was immense. After Samuel's death, the Bulgarian resistance continued under his son and other commanders, but the unity and strength of the state had been broken. Over the next few years, Byzantine forces continued to capture key cities and fortresses. In the year 1018, after the fall of Ohrid and the last major strongholds, the resistance finally collapsed. Bulgaria was formally incorporated into the Byzantine Empire. The fall of the First Bulgarian Empire marked the end of a remarkable chapter in medieval European history. For more than 3 centuries, Bulgaria had risen from a frontier khanate to a powerful Christian empire, rivaling Byzantium in culture, territory, and influence. Its rulers had shaped the religious and linguistic identity of the Slavic world, resisted external domination, and forged a unique place between East and West. The Byzantine annexation brought an end to Bulgarian political independence, but not to Bulgarian identity. The Bulgarian Church retained its patriarchate status for a time before being downgraded, and Bulgarian aristocrats continued to serve in the imperial administration. The cultural legacy of the empire, its language, its liturgical traditions, its literary works, endured. The fall of the First Bulgarian Empire in the early 11th century brought Bulgaria under the direct control of the Byzantine Empire, While the imperial banners of Constantinople now flew over cities like Preslav, Ohrid, and Skopje, the Bulgarian people did not vanish from the historical stage. Instead, they entered a new and complex chapter, one defined by foreign rule, cultural endurance, and the quiet preservation of national identity. Following the final defeat of the Bulgarian forces in the year 1018, Emperor Basil II integrated the Bulgarian lands into the Byzantine administrative system. The region was divided into several themes, Byzantine military provinces, each governed by a strategos or general appointed from Constantinople. These governors were tasked with maintaining order, collecting taxes, and ensuring loyalty to the emperor. Despite this tight administrative control, Basil II was cautious not to provoke unrest. In fact, Basil allowed a significant degree of religious autonomy in the early years of Byzantine rule. The Bulgarian Orthodox Church was initially permitted to retain its autocephalous status, although it was downgraded from a patriarchate to an archbishopric. The seat of the Bulgarian Church remained in Ohrid, where it continued to operate in the Slavic language and maintain Bulgarian ecclesiastical traditions. This ecclesiastical continuity provided a vital foundation for preserving Bulgarian identity, even as political authority was exercised from afar. However, this relative tolerance did not last forever. After Basil II's death in the year 1025, successive Byzantine emperors gradually eroded the autonomy of the Bulgarian Church and replaced many of its native clerics with Greek-speaking bishops loyal to Constantinople. Likewise, the central government began replacing local aristocrats with Byzantine officials, often unfamiliar with local customs or languages. Over time, this policy fostered resentment and alienation among the population. Economically, the Bulgarian lands remained important to the Byzantine Empire. The region provided grain, livestock, timber, and military recruits. Cities such as Skopje and Ohrid continued to serve as regional hubs for trade and administration. However, the new Byzantine taxation policies were heavy and frequently resented by local populations. Tax collectors operated under strict quotas, and corruption was not uncommon. For rural communities, already burdened by earlier wars and losses, this added pressure often pushed them into hardship. Culturally, however, Bulgaria did not vanish. Slavic literary traditions continued in monasteries and church schools, especially in the western regions. The use of Old Church Slavonic persisted in religious texts and services, even as the central government attempted to promote Greek as the administrative and ecclesiastical language. Monastic communities in places like Ohrid and the Rila Mountains became safe havens for cultural preservation, copying manuscripts and training new generations of clergy and scholars. One of the most important symbols of this cultural resilience was the Rila Monastery. Founded by the hermit Saint John of Rila during the late First Bulgarian Empire, it became an enduring center of Bulgarian spiritual life under Byzantine rule. Although remote, the monastery attracted pilgrims, monks, and students, and it maintained an active scriptorium where Slavic texts were preserved and produced. It served as a quiet but powerful reminder of Bulgaria's spiritual and intellectual heritage. Politically, the 11th and 12th centuries were relatively stable in comparison to the chaos that had marked the empire's final years. There were occasional revolts, but none achieved national scale. One of the early revolts occurred during the reign of Peter Delian in the mid-11th century. Claiming descent from the old royal line of Tsar Samuel, Delian led a popular uprising against Byzantine rule. Initially successful, his rebellion gained support across western Bulgaria and briefly re-established an independent Bulgarian administration. However, it was eventually crushed by imperial forces, aided by internal betrayal. Other, smaller uprisings occurred throughout this period, usually triggered by tax grievances, land seizures, or religious interference. These revolts often had regional goals rather than a coordinated national vision, and they were quickly suppressed. Nevertheless, they demonstrated that the spirit of independence had not disappeared. The memory of the First Bulgarian Empire, its glory under Simeon the Great and its last stand under Samuel, remained alive in popular consciousness. Throughout the 12th century, the Byzantine grip on Bulgaria began to weaken. The Central Empire itself was experiencing growing internal challenges, including dynastic struggles, corruption, and economic decline. The Komnenian dynasty, which had brought some revival to Byzantine fortunes, began to lose its effectiveness by the latter half of the century. Additionally, the growing threat of crusaders passing through the Balkans, as well as incursions by the Normans and later the Hungarians, distracted imperial attention from its Balkan provinces. By this time, a new generation of Bulgarians, descended from peasants, clergy, and local noble families, were emerging with renewed ambitions. Many of them were disillusioned by the corruption of imperial officials and the favoritism shown toward Greek-speaking elites. Tensions were particularly strong in the mountainous regions of central and northern Bulgaria, where resistance to Byzantine policies remained fierce. The decline of imperial authority, combined with the preservation of national identity through religious and cultural institutions, created fertile ground for political renewal. Local leaders began to organize resistance networks and forge alliances with discontented groups across the region. These efforts were not immediately revolutionary but steadily laid the groundwork for a broader uprising. By the final quarter of the 12th century, the political landscape of the Balkans was changing rapidly. The Byzantine Empire, once the dominant power in the region, was increasingly vulnerable. Years of internal corruption, dynastic instability, and mounting pressure from foreign invaders, Normans from the west, Seljuk Turks from the east, and Hungarians from the north, had weakened its hold over its vast territories. Among the most restive of these territories were the former Bulgarian lands. Here, after nearly 2 centuries of Byzantine domination, the flame of independence was once again igniting. The spark came in the year 1185 in the mountainous region around Turnovo, a strategically situated city in northern Bulgaria. It was here that 2 brothers, Peter and Asen, emerged as leaders of a growing resistance. Though their precise origins remain a subject of historical debate, most sources agree that they were of local aristocratic descent, likely members of the Bulgarian military or regional ruling class under Byzantine administration. The brothers initially approached Emperor Isaac II Angelus with a petition. They sought military land grants and official positions, likely as part of a broader effort to integrate local elites into the imperial system. However, their requests were dismissed, and they were reportedly insulted and beaten by the emperor's officials. This act of humiliation not only alienated them personally, but also symbolized the wider frustration of the Bulgarian population, frustration rooted in years of economic exploitation, administrative neglect, and cultural repression. Denied dignity and justice through peaceful means, Peter and Asen turned to rebellion. They began rallying local support by invoking memories of the First Bulgarian Empire and calling for the restoration of an independent Bulgarian state. Their message resonated widely, especially among the peasantry and disenfranchised military class, who had grown resentful of Byzantine taxation and misrule. The uprising began modestly, but spread quickly. Using the difficult terrain of the Balkan mountains to their advantage, the rebels launched surprise attacks on Byzantine garrisons and supply lines. They captured fortresses and secured key mountain passes, making it difficult for the imperial army to respond effectively. The Byzantines, preoccupied with external threats and internal power struggles, underestimated the seriousness of the rebellion. Within a short time, the rebellion transformed into a broader national movement. Peter adopted the title of Tsar, reviving the imperial tradition of the First Bulgarian Empire, and Asen took on military leadership. Together, they coordinated the expansion of the uprising into regions such as Moesia, Thrace, and parts of Macedonia. Many towns and villages welcomed the brothers as liberators, pledging loyalty to the newly declared Bulgarian state. In the early years of the conflict, the Byzantine response was inconsistent. Emperor Isaac II launched a counter-campaign against the rebels, leading imperial forces northward across the Balkan mountains. However, the rugged terrain, poor supply lines, and determined local resistance proved formidable. At one point, the imperial army was forced to retreat due to heavy snow and logistical failure, allowing the rebels to consolidate their gains further. The brothers also engaged in diplomatic efforts to strengthen their position. Asen, in particular, sought support from the Cumans, a powerful nomadic group living north of the Danube River. The Cumans, often at odds with the Byzantines, agreed to provide cavalry support in exchange for plunder and political favor. With this alliance, the Bulgarian forces gained a decisive edge in mobility and manpower. The new Bulgarian leadership also understood the importance of religious legitimacy. They worked to re-establish the Bulgarian Church, which had been suppressed and subordinated to the Patriarchate of Constantinople during Byzantine rule. The restoration of an independent Bulgarian ecclesiastical hierarchy reinforced the authority of the Tsars and united the population under a shared spiritual framework. In the following years, the Second Bulgarian Empire began to take shape. Turnovo, the center of the uprising, was transformed into the new capital. Situated atop steep hills and flanked by the Yantra River, it offered both natural defenses and symbolic strength. The city quickly developed into a political, military, and cultural hub, often referred to by later chroniclers as the New Constantinople, or the Second Rome, of the Balkans. Despite the growing strength of the Bulgarian state, the conflict with Byzantium remained unresolved. Emperor Isaac II attempted several additional campaigns to crush the rebellion, but these efforts were hampered by internal instability within the empire itself. In the year 1195, during yet another military expedition into Bulgarian territory, Isaac was overthrown in a palace coup and replaced by his brother Alexios III. This sudden change in leadership disrupted Byzantine military planning and gave the Bulgarians additional breathing room. Around the same time, Asen was assassinated under mysterious circumstances, possibly by rivals or agents of the Byzantine court. His death was a serious blow, but the rebellion did not collapse. Peter continued to rule, and leadership eventually passed to another brother, Kaloyan, who would later expand and strengthen the Second Bulgarian Empire even further. The uprising of Asen and Peter marked more than a military victory. It represented a rebirth of Bulgarian political identity. After nearly 2 centuries of foreign domination, the Bulgarians had once again established an independent state with its own rulers, church, language, and military. This revival was not merely nostalgic. It was built on a new foundation of pragmatism, alliance building, and popular support. With the death of Asen and later Peter, the leadership of the reborn Bulgarian state passed into the hands of their younger brother, Kaloyan. Taking the throne in the final years of the 12th century, Kaloyan inherited not only the crown of a newly restored kingdom, but also the challenges of securing its future amidst a volatile and fragmented Balkan world. The Byzantine Empire, though weakened, was still a threat. Hungary loomed to the north, and the Pope in Rome sought influence in the east. But perhaps most dramatically, a new wave of crusaders was preparing to cross into the region, setting into motion events that would upend the entire political order of southeastern Europe. Kaloyan assumed the title of Tsar around the year 1197. From the very beginning of his reign, he demonstrated a combination of political cunning and military skill that would define his rule. His first and most pressing challenge was legitimacy, not just among his own nobles but in the eyes of Europe. To ensure the survival of the Second Bulgarian Empire, he needed allies, recognition, and freedom from the constant threat of invasion by the more powerful states surrounding him. To this end, Kaloyan turned to the papacy. Unlike his predecessors, who had maintained close ties with the Orthodox Church, Kaloyan saw strategic advantage in aligning with the Catholic West. He initiated correspondence with Pope Innocent III, offering to recognize papal authority over the Bulgarian Church in exchange for a royal crown and formal recognition of his kingship. This was a bold diplomatic move that cleverly exploited the rivalries between Constantinople and Rome, and between Orthodox and Catholic Christianity. In the year 1200, Kaloyan's envoys returned from Rome bearing the papal crown. He was officially recognized as King of the Bulgarians and Vlachs by the Pope, and the Bulgarian Church was placed under the jurisdiction of Rome. Though the union with the Catholic Church would not endure for long, largely due to internal resistance and theological differences. It gave Kaloyan the international legitimacy he needed in a critical moment. This recognition came just as the Fourth Crusade was gathering momentum in the West. Originally intended to liberate Jerusalem, the crusade was soon diverted through a combination of debt, opportunism, and Byzantine intrigue. In the year 1204, Crusader armies seized Constantinople and established the Latin Empire, a Western Catholic state at the heart of former Byzantine territory. The old Byzantine nobility fled to regional power centers like Nicaea and Epirus, while the Latin occupiers began carving out new territories across the Balkans. Kaloyan watched these events with both alarm and opportunity. The collapse of Byzantine control left a power vacuum in the region. The Latin Empire was weak and unfamiliar with Balkan politics, while Greek populations resented the Crusaders' presence and often looked to local leaders for protection. Sensing a chance to expand Bulgarian influence and present himself as a defender of the Orthodox faithful, Kaloyan prepared for war. The result was a series of campaigns that pitted Kaloyan directly against the Latin Empire. His forces quickly captured several strategic cities in Thrace, including Philippopolis. However, the most famous and decisive moment of this conflict came at the Battle of Adrianople in the year 1205. At Adrianople, the Latin Emperor Baldwin of Flanders led a large crusader force to confront the Bulgarian army. Confident in their heavy cavalry, the Latins underestimated Kaloyan's use of tactics and terrain. Kaloyan, having already allied with the Cumans to the north, deployed a mobile force capable of swift attacks and retreats. During the battle, his troops feigned retreat, drawing the Latin knights into a trap. Surrounded and ambushed, the Latin army was decisively defeated. Emperor Baldwin was captured and later died in Bulgarian captivity, though the circumstances of his death remain unclear, with some sources suggesting execution, others natural causes. The victory at Adrianople sent shockwaves through Europe. The Latin Empire, barely established, had lost its emperor and much of its army. Kaloyan's reputation soared, both as a formidable military leader and as a dangerous adversary to the Western powers. For the Orthodox populations under Latin rule, Kaloyan now appeared as a potential liberator and protector. Despite his military success, Kaloyan's rule grew increasingly harsh in the years that followed. He began to refer to himself as Roman Slayer, a grim counterpart to Basil II's earlier title of Bulgar Slayer. His treatment of captured territories became more brutal, especially in areas that resisted his authority or remained loyal to Constantinople. Cities that opposed Bulgarian rule, such as Thessalonica and Ceres, were reported to have suffered massacres and severe punishment. Kaloyan's ambition to become a unifier of Orthodox resistance clashed with his Catholic alliance, leading to increasing tension with the papacy. Though initially embraced by Pope Innocent III, the brutality of Kaloyan's campaigns and his failure to enforce Roman Catholicism in Bulgaria caused Rome to reconsider the alliance. Kaloyan, in turn, distanced himself from the Catholic Church, and relations with the papacy cooled rapidly. Toward the end of his reign, Kaloyan turned his attention toward consolidating power and eliminating rivals among the Bulgarian nobility. This period of internal purges may have contributed to his eventual downfall. In the year 1207, Kaloyan was assassinated under mysterious circumstances, possibly by a member of his own court or during a siege. His death brought an abrupt end to one of the most dynamic and controversial reigns in Bulgarian history. The death of Tsar Kaloyan in the early 13th century left a power vacuum in the Bulgarian state, and in the years that followed, the Second Bulgarian Empire experienced a period of instability. Court intrigue, regency struggles, and shifting alliances threatened to unravel the achievements won through Kaloyan's military victories. However, out of this uncertainty emerged a new ruler, one who would bring the empire not only stability, but also diplomatic brilliance and cultural renaissance. That ruler was Ivan Asen II, remembered as one of the greatest statesmen in Bulgarian history. Ivan Asen II ascended the throne in the year 1221. His rise to power marked the restoration of the Asen dynasty after a brief interlude during which rival factions had taken control. His claim to legitimacy was rooted in both blood and vision. As the son of Ivan Asen I, he belonged to the royal lineage that had founded the Second Bulgarian Empire, and his early rule demonstrated a deep understanding of both the military and political complexities of the Balkans. Unlike his predecessor Kaloyan, whose reign was defined by warfare and confrontation with the Latin Empire and Byzantium, Ivan Asen II pursued a path of diplomacy, consolidation, and cultural flourishing. His first priority was to stabilize the internal situation. He swiftly moved to reassert royal authority over the aristocracy and the provinces, ensuring that regional governors remained loyal to the crown. Through a combination of force and negotiation, he brought rebellious factions under control and restored order to the heart of the empire. Ivan Asen II also understood the importance of securing international legitimacy and peaceful relations with neighboring powers. He strengthened ties with the papacy, the Latin Empire, and Hungary, even marrying into the Hungarian royal family to reinforce the alliance. This web of marriages and treaties allowed Bulgaria to avoid unnecessary conflict while expanding its diplomatic influence across Central and Southeastern Europe. These diplomatic strategies paid off handsomely. While other regional powers were embroiled in conflicts and crises, Bulgaria, under Ivan Asen II, experienced a period of peace and economic growth. Trade routes passing through the empire flourished, connecting the Adriatic to the Black Sea and drawing merchants from Venice, Genoa, and the eastern Mediterranean. Markets and cities prospered, and the Bulgarian treasury grew, allowing for investment in infrastructure, culture, and religion. The most striking example of Ivan Asen II's success came in the wake of the Battle of Klokotnitsa in the year 1230. The battle was a response to aggression by Theodore Komnenos Doukas, the ruler of the Despotate of Epirus, who invaded Bulgarian territory in violation of a previous alliance. Ivan Asen II moved swiftly, marching his army southward to confront the Epirote forces. The battle resulted in a stunning Bulgarian victory. Theodore was captured and his army was scattered. In the aftermath, Bulgarian control extended deep into Macedonia, northern Greece, and Albania. What made the aftermath of the battle especially notable was Ivan Asen's magnanimity. According to later chronicles, he released many of the captured soldiers and civilians, declaring that he did not wage war on the people, but only against those who broke their oaths. This gesture not only solidified his reputation as a just ruler, but also encouraged loyalty and cooperation from newly acquired territories. Following the victory at Klokotnitsa, Ivan Asen II was recognized as the dominant power in the Balkans. His authority now stretched from the Adriatic Sea to the Black Sea and from the Danube River to the outskirts of Thessalonica. At its height, the Second Bulgarian Empire under his rule was territorially larger than it had been under Kaloyan and approached the grandeur of Simeon the Great's era in the First Empire. During this time of expansion, Ivan Asen II also focused on strengthening the Bulgarian Church. Having distanced the empire from the Catholic alliance forged under Kaloyan, he turned back toward the Eastern Orthodox tradition. In the year 1235, the Bulgarian Church regained its autocephalous status, and the Patriarchate was restored with its seat in Turnovo. This development had deep symbolic importance. It affirmed Bulgaria's religious independence, reinforced national identity, and placed the country once again at the heart of the Orthodox Christian world. Turnovo itself flourished under Ivan Asen II's patronage. It became a vibrant center of art, architecture, and theological scholarship. Churches and monasteries were built or renovated, featuring distinctive frescoes, stonework, and inscriptions that reflected both Byzantine and local traditions. The literary schools in Turnovo and nearby monasteries continued the legacy of Slavic Christian literature, copying and creating texts in Old Church Slavonic. The intellectual and spiritual life of the empire was in full bloom. The death of Ivan Asen II in the early 13th century marked the end of one of the most stable and prosperous reigns in Bulgarian history. Under his leadership, the Second Bulgarian Empire had reached the height of its territorial power, extending across much of the Central Balkans and commanding both respect and influence among its neighbors. But following his death, the empire entered a period of growing vulnerability. Leadership weakened, internal divisions widened, and an emerging power from the east, the Mongols, would soon disrupt the fragile balance of power in southeastern Europe. The immediate problem after Ivan Asen II's death was succession. His designated heir, Kaloyan Asen I, was a child at the time of his accession. A child monarch in a medieval polity already rife with factionalism and aristocratic ambition, invited instability. Kaloyan's reign, which lasted only a few years, was marked by regency struggles, palace intrigue, and the erosion of central authority. Although he was a legitimate heir, the boy Tsar had neither the experience nor the commanding presence needed to control the ambitious boyars who increasingly dominated the court. The aristocracy, especially the powerful provincial nobles, began asserting greater autonomy. Many of them maintained private armies, collected their own taxes, and administered local justice with little regard for royal directives. The central government in Turnovo struggled to enforce its authority, and the cohesion that had defined even Asen II's reign began to unravel. The erosion of centralized control created fertile ground for both domestic unrest and foreign intervention. One of the most dangerous external threats came not from Byzantium or the Latin West, but from the far reaches of the Asian steppes. The Mongol Empire, forged under Genghis Khan and expanded by his successors, had swept across Eurasia, subduing vast territories from China to the borders of Europe. By the mid-13th century, Mongol forces under Batu Khan had advanced into Eastern Europe, crushing armies in Rus, Poland, and Hungary. The Mongols demonstrated not only overwhelming military force, but also a keen interest in securing vassal states to expand their sphere of control without always resorting to direct occupation. Bulgaria, caught in the path of Mongol expansion, was forced to reckon with this new and formidable presence. In the year approximately 1242, Mongol forces launched a campaign into Bulgarian territory, causing widespread destruction in the northeastern parts of the empire. Unable to resist such an overwhelming invasion, the Bulgarian government, under the weakened rule of Kaloyan Asen's successors, chose to submit to Mongol overlordship. As a result, Bulgaria became a tributary to the Golden Horde, the western segment of the Mongol Empire. While the Mongols did not establish direct rule, they demanded tribute in the form of money, goods, and possibly even soldiers. This subservient relationship deeply impacted Bulgarian political sovereignty. It marked the first time since the foundation of the Second Bulgarian Empire that an external force could dictate terms to the state without open conflict. Though the tribute arrangement brought a temporary reprieve from further Mongol raids, it also humiliated the court and further undermined royal prestige. Meanwhile, within Bulgaria, the succession crisis deepened. The period from the mid to late 13th century witnessed a rapid turnover of monarchs. Rulers such as Michael Asen I, Constantine Tikasin, and Smilets came and went, often the victims of coups, assassinations, or military defeats. Some claimed legitimacy through bloodlines, others through marriage, but few were able to rule with the authority and effectiveness of Ivan Asen II. The aristocracy grew ever more powerful, turning the empire into a patchwork of quasi-independent territories. Regional boyars in places like Vidin, Karvuna, and the Rhodope Mountains operated almost like feudal lords, often ignoring royal directives and pursuing their own interests. These internal divisions made it nearly impossible to coordinate responses to foreign threats or implement consistent policies. At the same time, religious authority, once a unifying force under the restored Patriarchate of Turnovo, began to splinter as well. The church remained influential, but it was increasingly caught in the web of political power plays. Patriarchs were appointed or removed depending on their loyalty to the ruling faction. and the spiritual unity that had once supported national identity weakened under the weight of secular ambitions. Despite this instability, there were still flickers of resilience. Certain rulers attempted reforms or military campaigns to reassert Bulgarian strength. Constantine Asen, for example, reigned for over 2 decades and tried to restore royal authority by marrying into the Nicaean imperial family, seeking alliances with Serbian and Hungarian powers, and engaging in defensive campaigns against Byzantine advances. However, his efforts were undermined by persistent internal rebellion and the lingering shadow of Mongol dominance. Bulgaria's position in the regional hierarchy was slipping. Serbia, once a junior power, began asserting itself more forcefully. The restored Byzantine Empire under the Palaiologos dynasty also recovered enough strength to challenge Bulgarian claims in Macedonia and Thrace. The Latin principalities, though weakened, still controlled parts of the Aegean and had the backing of Western crusaders. In this crowded and competitive environment, a fragmented and unstable Bulgaria struggled to maintain its influence. The cultural and economic life of the empire suffered as well. While cities like Turnovo and Vidin retained some of their former prominence, they no longer matched the vitality seen during even Asen II's time. Trade slowed, infrastructure deteriorated, and artistic production declined. Monasteries continued to function and preserve the literary traditions of earlier centuries, but the state lacked the resources and organization to support broad cultural patronage. The Mongol threat, while not always visible in daily life, remained a constant backdrop to political decision-making. Tribute payments drained the treasury and limited Bulgaria's ability to invest in defense or administration. The threat of renewed Mongol invasions loomed over any ruler who dared defy their demands. Moreover, the Mongol presence in neighboring regions, particularly in Crimea and southern Rus, meant that the northern and eastern frontiers of the empire remained permanently insecure. As the political strength of the Second Bulgarian Empire diminished through the later decades of the 13th century, Bulgaria's spiritual and cultural life found a powerful refuge in its capital, Turnovo. Perched atop the steep hills overlooking the Yantra River, Turnovo had been the political heart of the restored empire since the uprising of Asen and Peter. But in the face of growing military threats and political fragmentation, the city assumed a different role, one that placed it among the most significant centers of medieval Orthodox civilization. Turnovo emerged as more than just a royal seat or administrative hub. During the 13th and 14th centuries, it developed into a beacon of learning, literature, theology, and art. Chroniclers and later historians would refer to it as the Second Constantinople, or Third Rome, a title shared with few other places in the Orthodox world. This cultural flowering was not accidental. It was fostered by a conscious effort on the part of Bulgarian rulers, clergy, and scholars to define and preserve a distinct Bulgarian spiritual identity, even as external powers pressed on the empire's borders and internal cohesion frayed. The foundation of Turnovo's rise as a cultural capital had been laid earlier during the reigns of Ivan Asen II and his predecessors. However, it was during the reign of Tsar Theodore Svetoslav and especially Tsar Ivan Alexander that Turnovo reached the peak of its artistic and intellectual influence. In these decades, Bulgaria's imperial power was waning, but the court and church poured significant energy and resources into reinforcing national traditions through monastic, literary, and artistic endeavors. A key element in Turnovo's cultural vitality was the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. Having regained autocephalous status earlier in the century, the church served as a powerful institution not only of faith but also of education and cultural production. The Patriarchate of Turnovo, re-established with great prestige, actively supported theological scholarship and church-sponsored arts. Patriarchs during this period, including figures such as Euthemius of Turnovo, played leading roles in advancing spiritual and literary reform. One of the central engines of Turnovo's cultural renaissance was the so-called Turnovo Literary School. Not a school in the modern institutional sense, it was rather a movement, a collective of educated clergy, scribes, monks, and intellectuals who sought to refine and elevate Slavic Orthodox literature. Their goals included correcting poorly translated liturgical texts, composing original religious works, and promoting consistent orthography and grammar in Church Slavonic. Under the guidance of Patriarch Euthemius, the Turnovo Literary School produced a wealth of high-quality religious texts, lives of saints, homilies, and translations from Greek. Euthemius himself was a prolific writer and editor. His work set standards for ecclesiastical language and style that would influence not only Bulgaria, but also the literary traditions of Serbia, Wallachia, and even the distant principalities of Rus. His intellectual authority was so respected that disciples of the Turnovo tradition carried his methods into other Slavic lands, forming what is now sometimes referred to as the Euthemian Reform. In the monasteries surrounding Turnovo and across Bulgaria, scribes carefully copied texts on parchment, decorated with ornate initials and miniatures. These manuscripts were not only religious documents, they were also expressions of artistic excellence. Illuminated manuscripts from this era demonstrate a high degree of sophistication, blending Byzantine stylistic elements with uniquely Bulgarian themes. The artistry of the period, while rooted in Orthodox canons, showed regional originality that made it distinct from the art produced in Constantinople or Thessalonica. Alongside literary production, Turnovo saw a flourishing of religious architecture. The city and its surrounding countryside became dotted with churches and monasteries, many of which were adorned with frescoes and iconography that exemplified the spiritual aesthetics of the age. Notable examples include the Church of the Holy 40 Martyrs and the Church of Saints Peter and Paul. These structures, often sponsored by royal or noble patrons, served as both places of worship and statements of dynastic piety. The Church of the Holy 40 Martyrs, in particular, stood as a symbol of Bulgarian imperial pride. Constructed in honor of a major victory, it became a royal mausoleum and spiritual centerpiece of Turnovo. Inscriptions carved into its stone walls, such as those commemorating the deeds of earlier rulers, emphasized the continuity of Bulgarian statehood and identity, even during times of military decline. This cultural activity was not limited to the clergy. The royal court, under Tsar Ivan Alexander, became a notable patron of the arts. Ivan Alexander, who ruled during the mid-14th century, commissioned richly illustrated manuscripts, including the famous Tetra Evangelia, a lavishly decorated gospel book produced by court scribes and artists. These manuscripts not only served liturgical functions, but also reflected the grandeur of the Tsar's authority and the refinement of Bulgarian civilization. The court also supported musical development. While medieval Bulgarian music remains less well documented than its literary counterparts, there is evidence of a vibrant tradition of liturgical chanting and musical notation based on Byzantine systems. Music accompanied church services and was an integral part of the religious experience cultivated in Turnovo's cathedrals and monastic communities. Despite the brilliance of this cultural age, it occurred against a backdrop of political fragility. The strength of Turnovo's intellectual and artistic life often contrasted sharply with the instability of Bulgaria's frontiers and the weakness of its military. Yet this paradox is not unique in history. Just as Constantinople produced its finest mosaics even as Ottoman armies approached its gates, so too did Turnovo shine culturally even as the empire surrounding it faltered. Indeed, one might argue that this cultural investment was a deliberate response to political anxiety. In the face of external threats from the Byzantines, Hungarians, and increasingly the advancing Ottomans, Bulgarian leaders and clerics turned inward to preserve what was most essential: faith, language, and heritage. The creation of beautiful manuscripts, the construction of enduring churches, and the articulation of refined theology were acts of both devotion and defiance. The legacy of Turnovo's cultural flowering would extend far beyond its time. When the Ottoman conquest of the Balkans accelerated in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, many Bulgarian clerics, monks, and scribes fled to other Orthodox lands. They carried with them books, practices, and educational methods developed in Turnovo. As a result, the intellectual traditions of medieval Bulgaria influenced the development of Orthodox Christianity in neighboring regions, especially in Serbia and the Russian principalities. As the 14th century progressed, the Second Bulgarian Empire continued to face mounting pressures, internally from fractious noble families and externally from ambitious neighbors. The cultural brilliance of Turnovo and the efforts of enlightened rulers like Ivan Alexander could not mask a growing and dangerous reality. The empire was fragmenting. The strong, centralized authority that had once allowed Bulgaria to dominate the Balkans had given way to competing aristocrats, weakening royal control and hastening decline. One of the defining features of this period was the rise of powerful regional lords who ruled almost independently from the central authority in Turnovo. These boyars controlled strategic territories, held private armies, and often acted in their own interest, regardless of the policies or ambitions of the reigning Tsar. Their autonomy was fueled by the monarchy's reliance on their support for military campaigns and domestic governance, as well as the lack of a reliable standing army or robust central bureaucracy to check their power. This process of feudalization was not unique to Bulgaria. Across Europe during the late medieval period, kings and emperors often found their authority contested by powerful nobles. However, in Bulgaria, the situation was especially dire due to the empire's geographic vulnerabilities, external threats, and its reliance on aristocratic military support. As the balance of power tipped away from the monarchy, the integrity of the Bulgarian state suffered greatly. Tsar Ivan Alexander, who ruled during the mid-14th century, attempted to maintain unity through dynastic alliances, church patronage, and central reforms. His reign saw a continuation of Turnovo's cultural renaissance and relative peace for several years. However, one of his most fateful decisions was the division of the realm between his sons. Ivan Alexander had multiple children from 2 marriages. In an effort to provide for his heirs and perhaps secure peaceful succession, he granted co-rulership to his eldest son Ivan Sratsimir, placing him in control of the northwestern region centered around the city of Vidin. Later, he granted the southeastern territories, including the important city of Preslav, to another son, Ivan Asen. Though intended as a means of strengthening the dynasty's grip over the realm, this act had the opposite effect. Rather than uniting the kingdom, it formalized its fragmentation. By the time of Ivan Alexander's death, Bulgaria had effectively split into 3 loosely connected or outright competing entities: the central kingdom based in Turnovo, the Vidin Tsardom in the northwest, and a semi-autonomous region in the southeast. Each had its own military forces, political agenda, and external relations. This division weakened Bulgaria's ability to respond to foreign threats and reduced its influence on the wider stage of Balkan politics. Meanwhile, to the west, Serbia was rising in strength. Under leaders such as Stefan Dusan, the Serbian state expanded rapidly, incorporating much of Macedonia and northern Greece. For a time, Serbia even aspired to inherit the mantle of the Byzantine Empire, declaring its own patriarchate and proclaiming Dusan as emperor. Although Bulgaria and Serbia shared religious and cultural ties, their rivalry for control over the Central Balkans often led to uneasy truces and occasional conflicts. To the south, the restored Byzantine Empire under the Palaiologos dynasty was itself in decline, beset by civil wars and internal chaos. However, even a weakened Byzantium still competed with Bulgaria for influence over disputed border regions. At times, Bulgarian rulers allied with one of the Byzantine factions, only to find themselves betrayed or drawn into the empire's internal strife. These opportunistic entanglements often distracted from Bulgaria's more pressing strategic needs. Economic conditions also began to deteriorate in the latter half of the 14th century. The empire's traditional trade routes were disrupted by warfare and regional instability. Local economies suffered under the weight of military taxation, banditry, and inconsistent law enforcement. As central authority faltered, many towns and villages became subject to arbitrary rule by local magnates or even brigand leaders who filled the vacuum left by the disintegrating state. Compounding these difficulties was the growing demographic and agricultural crisis. Several factors contributed to population decline, including famine, disease, and migration. While the Black Death had ravaged much of Europe in the mid-14th century, its full impact on Bulgaria is less well documented. Nonetheless, its spread likely contributed to labor shortages, reduced agricultural productivity, and weakened social structures. A diminished rural population meant fewer resources for taxation, fewer recruits for military campaigns, and reduced manpower to maintain infrastructure. The Church, one of the few institutions still capable of exerting wide influence, remained a center of stability, especially in cultural and spiritual life. However, even within the Church, divisions began to emerge. As noble families gained power, they often sought to install loyal clerics in key ecclesiastical positions, undermining the Patriarchate's independence. Although figures like Patriarch Euthymius of Turnovo would continue to resist this trend and defend the integrity of the Church, the institution's influence could not fully counterbalance the political disintegration underway. Amid this general decline, Bulgaria's foreign policy became reactive and inconsistent. Lacking the strength to project power, czars often found themselves seeking alliances through marriage or military pacts with larger powers such as Hungary or the Byzantine Empire. These relationships were typically short-lived and based more on immediate survival than long-term strategy. The czars were also increasingly isolated diplomatically. The Latin states of the Adriatic, the Crusader remnants in the Aegean, and the rising maritime republics such as Venice and Genoa had little interest in propping up a divided and faltering Bulgarian kingdom. As the Second Bulgarian Empire continued to decline during the later 14th century, it found itself increasingly squeezed between two fading but still active regional powers, the Byzantine Empire to the southeast and the Serbian state to the west. Both had once been Bulgaria's rivals in their own right, and both now faced existential threats from the rising Ottoman Turks. Yet rather than forging a stable alliance among Christian states, the late medieval Balkans descended into a complex web of shifting rivalries, opportunistic diplomacy, and fractured loyalties. In this dangerous game, Bulgaria found itself unable to assert leadership or unity, increasingly sidelined as more aggressive neighbors shaped the region's fate. By this time, the restored Byzantine Empire under the Palaiologos dynasty was a shadow of its former self. Constantinople remained its symbolic heart, but imperial authority barely extended beyond the walls of the capital. Much of the former empire had been carved up into semi-independent despotates or taken by Latin crusader states. Civil wars within Byzantium, particularly the conflict between John V Palaiologos and John VI Cantacuzénos, further weakened the state's capacity to resist external threats. Nonetheless, even in its diminished condition, Byzantium remained a diplomatic player, often seeking to manipulate neighboring powers to preserve its survival. Bulgaria, fractured by internal division and feudal decentralization, became entangled in these Byzantine disputes. At times, Bulgarian czars offered military support to one claimant or another, hoping to win territorial concessions or favorable trade terms. However, these interventions usually yielded little long-term benefit and sometimes dragged Bulgaria into conflicts that further drained its resources. Meanwhile, to the west, the Serbian state was rising in both ambition and capacity. Under King Stefan Uroš IV Dusan, Serbia had expanded rapidly during the mid-14th century, taking advantage of Byzantine weakness to seize territory in Macedonia, northern Greece, and Albania. In the year when Dusan crowned himself Emperor of the Serbs and Greeks, he was clearly positioning Serbia as the successor to Byzantium's imperial legacy. This Serbian expansion came partly at Bulgaria's expense. The two states had long-standing cultural and religious ties, including a shared adherence to Eastern Orthodoxy and frequent intermarriage among their royal families. However, the ambitions of Serbian rulers often conflicted with Bulgarian interests, especially in contested border areas such as Macedonia. Although formal warfare between the two states was limited during this period, the growing Serbian influence in the region further reduced Bulgaria's political and military options. Relations between the Serbian and Bulgarian courts fluctuated. At times, dynastic marriages were arranged to secure alliances. One such notable marriage occurred between Tsar Ivan Alexander's daughter and the Serbian ruler. These marriages were not merely ceremonial. They were intended to forge bonds of mutual interest and peace between rival states. Yet these alliances were often short-lived or undermined by competing ambitions and mistrust. Serbia's growing power also caused alarm in Byzantium. The Byzantines, desperate to contain Serbian influence, at times encouraged Bulgarian resistance to Dusan's rule or sought to drive a wedge between the Slavic kingdoms. These Byzantine maneuvers occasionally succeeded in stalling Serbian expansion but did little to strengthen Bulgaria's position. In fact, Bulgaria's role increasingly resembled that of a buffer zone, caught between greater powers that used diplomacy and intrigue to influence events on its soil. Bulgaria's inability to play these rivalries to its advantage stemmed from both internal weakness and strategic miscalculations. The division of the empire into separate principalities, most notably the Vidin Tsardom and the Central Kingdom in Turnovo, meant that Bulgaria often spoke with more than one voice. Each ruler sought his own advantage, making it difficult to present a unified front in negotiations or to coordinate policy toward foreign states. The rivalry between Vidin and Turnovo not only weakened the empire's military capabilities, but also diluted its diplomatic leverage. While the central Tsar in Turnovo might attempt to maintain cordial relations with Serbia or Byzantium, the ruler in Vidin could simultaneously pursue an opposing strategy. This lack of cohesion made Bulgaria unreliable as an ally and vulnerable as a target. At the same time, external threats were growing more immediate. The Ottomans, having established a permanent presence in Europe following their capture of Gallipoli, expanded their control over Thrace and eastern Macedonia. Their advance posed a direct challenge to both Byzantine and Bulgarian territories. Yet the Balkan states, preoccupied with their rivalries, failed to mount a coordinated response. Serbia, under Dusan, made some efforts to organize resistance to the Ottoman advance, but his sudden death halted these plans. His successor, Stefan Uroš V, lacked the authority and vision to unite the Serbian lords. Byzantium continued to lose ground, and its appeals for Western aid, particularly from the papacy, resulted in only limited and delayed crusading efforts. Bulgaria, for its part, remained largely passive in the face of the Ottoman threat. Some Bulgarian rulers attempted to maintain neutrality, hoping to avoid provoking conflict. Others entered into tributary arrangements, paying the Ottomans in exchange for limited autonomy. These short-term strategies may have bought time, but they did not stop the encroachment of Ottoman forces into the heart of the Balkans. Moreover, the lack of trust between Bulgaria, Serbia, and Byzantium meant that no meaningful coalition could be formed. The dream of a united Christian front against the Ottoman advance, often promoted by church leaders and some idealistic rulers, never materialized in practice. Each state looked inward or sought its own survival, even as their enemies grew stronger and more organized. As the 14th century drew to a close, it became increasingly clear that the balance of power in the Balkans had shifted irreversibly. The Byzantine Empire clung to survival within the walls of Constantinople. Serbia fractured into semi-independent fiefdoms, and Bulgaria, weakened by dynastic fragmentation and missed opportunities, lacked the cohesion and leadership needed to defend its sovereignty. As the 14th century approached its final decades, the growing shadow of the Ottoman Empire loomed ever larger over the Balkan Peninsula. What had once seemed like a distant Anatolian principality had, in a matter of decades, evolved into a powerful and expansionist state with a disciplined army, a clear sense of purpose, and an effective administrative system. While the states of southeastern Europe were preoccupied with internal disputes and mutual rivalries, the Ottomans established a firm presence on European soil, and the consequences would prove irreversible. The first significant Ottoman foothold in Europe came with the capture of Gallipoli in the middle of the 14th century. This strategic conquest allowed them to control the passage between Asia and Europe and to move troops and resources across the Dardanelles with ease. From there, the Ottomans began their methodical advance into Thrace and Macedonia. Their strategy combined military force with diplomacy, often offering vassalage or tribute terms to local rulers in exchange for nominal independence and future cooperation. Bulgaria, by this time, was a divided realm. The central Bulgarian kingdom was based in Turnovo under Tsar Ivan Shishman, while the northwestern territory centered around Vidin was ruled by his half-brother Ivan Sratsimir. The southeastern region, formerly under the rule of Ivan Asen, had by then fallen under the increasing influence of external forces and lost its political cohesion. The fragmentation of the empire had left it deeply vulnerable. Worse still, each ruler focused primarily on the survival of his own territory, rather than coordinating a united response to the rising threat. Tsar Ivan Shishman ruled from Turnovo, the traditional seat of Bulgarian spiritual and political authority. His reign, beginning in the early years of the latter half of the 14th century, was immediately overshadowed by Ottoman encroachment. Although young and energetic, Ivan Shishman lacked the resources and alliances necessary to face the Ottomans effectively. His position was made even more precarious by the fact that his father, Tsar Ivan Alexander, had divided the empire among his sons, weakening its unity and capacity for defense. As Ottoman armies approached Bulgarian borders, Ivan Shishman attempted to balance diplomacy and resistance. Initially, he agreed to pay tribute to the Ottomans, hoping to preserve a measure of autonomy and buy time. He even arranged for a marriage alliance, giving his sister in marriage to Sultan Murad I, a customary strategy in medieval diplomacy. But these measures failed to stop the Ottoman advance. The tribute did not guarantee peace, and marriage alliances were often treated as temporary conveniences rather than lasting bonds. The Ottomans, for their part, had no intention of halting their campaign. Their system was designed to incorporate newly conquered territories into the expanding imperial structure. Local rulers who agreed to become vassals might be left in place for a time, but ultimate authority shifted toward the Sultan's court, and the presence of Ottoman garrisons increasingly constrained local sovereignty. Bulgarian cities, fortresses, and trade routes came under pressure, and the movement of Bulgarian populations was disrupted by constant military activity. In the face of this escalating danger, Ivan Shishman eventually chose to resist. Breaking his earlier arrangement, he ceased tribute payments and prepared for military defense. This act of defiance prompted a renewed Ottoman offensive under Sultan Murad I and later his son, Bayezid I. Ottoman forces moved with precision, targeting strategic fortresses along the Balkan mountains and the plains north of Turnovo. Many Bulgarian towns, unable to withstand siege or fearful of destruction, surrendered or negotiated terms. One of the most critical moments came with the siege of Turnovo itself. As the spiritual and cultural heart of Bulgaria, the fall of Turnovo would carry enormous symbolic and strategic weight. Despite determined resistance by the defenders and the leadership of Ivan Shishman, the city eventually succumbed to Ottoman assault in the final decade of the 14th century. The capture of Turnovo marked not just a military victory for the Ottomans, but the effective end of central Bulgarian sovereignty. With Turnovo under Ottoman control, Ivan Shishman retreated to the north, continuing the struggle from the Danubian fortress of Nikopol. He remained defiant and launched minor counterattacks, but his ability to resist was limited. In time, he was captured and executed on the orders of Sultan Bayezid I, bringing his reign and the independent Turnovo kingdom to a tragic close. Even as Turnovo fell, the Vidin Tsardom under Ivan Sratsimir continued to hold out in the northwest. Vidin, located along the Danube River and fortified by its position and walls, became the last major Bulgarian stronghold. Ivan Sratsimir had also earlier submitted to Ottoman suzerainty, only to renege when the threat intensified. Like his half-brother, he too sought Western aid, looking especially toward Hungary and the papacy for support. Indeed, in response to the growing Ottoman presence in the Balkans, Western powers began to stir. The idea of a crusade to push back against the Ottomans gained some traction, especially in Hungary and among the papal authorities. This culminated in the so-called Crusade of Nicopolis, a joint Christian military effort in the final years of the 14th century that included forces from Hungary, France, the Holy Roman Empire, and other European states. Ivan Sratsimir joined the crusading alliance, hoping that a decisive Western victory might preserve his realm and perhaps even reverse the Ottoman advance. However, the campaign ended in disaster. The Crusader forces, poorly coordinated and overconfident, were decisively defeated by Sultan Bayezid at the Battle of Nicopolis. The aftermath of the battle shattered hopes of a Western-led recovery of the Balkans and left Vidin dangerously exposed. With the fall of Turnovo and then Vidin, the Second Bulgarian Empire came to a definitive end. The final decades of the 14th century had seen the gradual dismantling of Bulgarian political independence, and by the early 15th century, nearly all former Bulgarian territories had been absorbed into the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire. What remained was not a sovereign state, but a subjugated land under foreign control. And yet, despite the collapse of the Bulgarian monarchy and the imposition of Ottoman rule, Bulgarian culture, religion, and identity did not disappear. They adapted, resisted, and endured. The Ottoman conquest of Bulgaria did not happen in one sweeping campaign, but rather through a series of methodical advances. The Ottomans employed a mix of military might and pragmatic diplomacy. Where possible, they co-opted local rulers as vassals before fully annexing their lands. This tactic allowed for the gradual integration of Bulgarian regions into the Ottoman administrative structure and avoided unnecessary destruction of productive areas. The cities of Turnovo and Vidin, once vibrant centers of Bulgarian statehood, were now transformed into provincial Ottoman towns, governed by appointed officials and fortified with garrisons. Following the fall of Turnovo, Tsar Ivan Shishman continued his resistance from the Danube fortress of Nikopol. His efforts were valiant but ultimately futile. Isolated from the West and with no strong allies remaining, he lacked the capacity to defend even the most critical regions. His eventual capture and execution sent a clear message: the Ottomans would tolerate no further claims to Bulgarian kingship. In Vidin, Ivan Sratsimir's fate was similar. Although he managed to hold out longer than his half-brother in Turnovo, his cooperation with Western Crusaders in the failed campaign of Nicopolis provoked Ottoman retaliation. Once Vidin fell, Ivan Sratsimir was captured and removed from power. Some sources suggest he was imprisoned in the Ottoman heartland. Others imply he was executed. Regardless of the precise details, his disappearance marked the formal extinguishing of Bulgarian political independence. With both branches of the Asen dynasty eliminated and their realms dismantled, the Ottomans began the full integration of Bulgarian lands into their empire. The former territories of the Second Bulgarian Empire were divided into administrative units known as sanjaks, each governed by a sanjak bey appointed by the Sultan. These were further subdivided into smaller districts, with land grants allocated to Ottoman officials and soldiers as part of the Timar system, a feudal-like arrangement designed to secure loyalty and sustain the military. One of the most immediate consequences of Ottoman rule was the dismantling of the Bulgarian aristocracy. Many noble families who had once held power were stripped of their lands, exiled, or forced to convert to Islam in exchange for limited privileges. Others fled to neighboring Christian territories, particularly in Wallachia, Moldavia, and the Kingdom of Hungary, where they often retained their status in exile. Some members of the Bulgarian elite did enter Ottoman service and rose to prominence within the empire, but they did so as individuals cut off from their former national institutions. Despite the political collapse, the Bulgarian Orthodox Church remained a vital institution. Although the Patriarchate of Turnovo was suppressed and subordinated to the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople, many Bulgarian bishops, abbots, and priests continued to serve their communities. Monasteries such as the Rila Monastery became sanctuaries of Bulgarian language, faith, and identity. Monks copied manuscripts, preserved hagiographies, and kept alive the memory of the saints, rulers, and scholars of the medieval era. The Ottomans, as part of their broader policy of managing a multi-ethnic and multi-religious empire, allowed Orthodox Christians to practice their faith as part of the millet system. While subject to heavier taxation and excluded from certain public offices, Christians were permitted to maintain their religious hierarchies and local customs. This policy allowed Bulgarian culture to survive and even retain a measure of cohesion under occupation, particularly in the countryside and mountain regions where Ottoman authority was less intrusive. However, Ottoman rule also brought profound changes to Bulgarian society. Islam gradually expanded, especially in urban centers and among segments of the population seeking better social and economic conditions. The devshirme system, through which Christian boys were taken from their families, converted to Islam, and trained for service in the Ottoman administration or Janissary Corps, created generational trauma but also produced some of the most capable military and political leaders of the empire. Ironically, several high-ranking Ottoman officials of the 15th and 16th centuries would be of Bulgarian origin, individuals who had risen through the very system that had conquered their homeland. Economically, Bulgaria was integrated into the Ottoman commercial network. Markets shifted to reflect new trade routes centered on Ottoman interests, and Bulgarian towns, such as Sofia, Plovdiv, and Vidin, evolved to accommodate Turkish settlers, merchants, and administrators. While some areas benefited from this integration through increased trade and infrastructure, others experienced economic decline, especially where depopulation or destruction had occurred during the initial conquests. Culturally, the legacy of the Second Bulgarian Empire lived on in literature, folklore, and oral tradition. Epic poems, legends, and songs about the last Tsars, heroic defenders, and lost kingdoms circulated among the people, keeping the memory of independence alive. These narratives often took on mythic dimensions, blending history and symbolism into powerful expressions of national identity. Figures like Ivan Shishman were transformed into folk heroes, tragic symbols of resistance against foreign domination. The conquest of the Second Bulgarian Empire by the Ottomans in the late 14th and early 15th centuries marked a profound turning point in the history of the Bulgarian people. For the first time in centuries, Bulgaria no longer existed as a sovereign state. Yet, while its political structures had collapsed, its cultural and spiritual identity persisted. Over the next 5 centuries, Bulgaria would remain under Ottoman domination, but it would never completely lose its sense of self. The memory of the empire, its saints, scholars, czars, and traditions, lived on in monasteries, villages, songs, and scripture, quietly sustaining a people who refused to forget. Under Ottoman rule, the Bulgarian territories were incorporated into the vast imperial system as a collection of sanjaks and vilayets, ruled by appointed governors and administered according to Islamic law. The Ottomans, though conquerors, were pragmatic administrators. Rather than eradicating local traditions, they allowed Orthodox Christian communities to maintain their religious institutions, languages, and customs, so long as they submitted to imperial authority, paid taxes, and refrained from rebellion. This arrangement was formalized under the millet system, which recognized the Orthodox Church as the representative authority for Christian subjects of the empire. The Patriarch of Constantinople became the official head of the Orthodox millet, wielding not only spiritual authority but also certain administrative powers on behalf of the Sultan. For Bulgarians, this meant that while their own Patriarchate of Turnovo had been abolished, their religious identity could still be maintained through the structures of the broader Eastern Orthodox Church. The Church thus became the primary institution preserving Bulgarian culture during the centuries of foreign rule. Monasteries such as Rila, Bachkovo, and Troyan remained active centers of worship, education, and manuscript preservation. These monastic communities served as refuges for Bulgarian clerics, scholars, and students. They copied and safeguarded liturgical texts, hagiographies, historical chronicles, and works of theology, all written in Church Slavonic and retaining a distinct Bulgarian flavor. These spiritual strongholds preserved not only Christian faith, but also the literary and linguistic heritage of medieval Bulgaria. While the Ottoman authorities tolerated the existence of these institutions, Christians remained second-class subjects. They were subject to additional taxes such as the jizya, a tax levied on non-Muslims, and were excluded from positions of power and influence within the state. Their churches could not rival the mosques in size or prominence, and their public religious expression was restricted. Moreover, Christian boys were taken under the devshirme system and converted to Islam, becoming soldiers in the elite Janissary Corps or servants in the Ottoman court. While some of these youths rose to great heights, even reaching the rank of Grand Vizier, the practice created lasting trauma in many Bulgarian communities. Despite these hardships, the Bulgarian people adapted. In the villages and mountain settlements, they developed a strong oral tradition that helped preserve national identity. Folk tales, epic songs, and legends passed from generation to generation often told of heroic defenders, lost kings, and miraculous saints. These stories, while sometimes fictionalized, kept alive the memory of the medieval Bulgarian kingdoms and their resistance to foreign domination. In this way, oral tradition functioned as an unofficial history, offering hope and identity in the absence of statehood. One recurring figure in Bulgarian folklore was Tsar Ivan Shishman, the last ruler of Turnovo. Though defeated by the Ottomans, he became a symbol of defiance and martyrdom. Songs portrayed him as a valiant fighter who refused to surrender his faith, even when faced with death. In these stories, Ivan Shishman lived on not as a failed monarch, but as a national hero whose sacrifice gave meaning to the continued struggle of the people. Similar reverence was given to saints like John of Rila, whose life of spiritual devotion inspired generations of monks and believers. Cultural identity also persisted through the preservation of the Bulgarian language. While Turkish became the language of administration and urban elites, the vast majority of the rural population continued to speak Bulgarian in daily life. Church Slavonic remained the language of worship, helping to preserve a sense of linguistic continuity with the medieval past. In the monastic schools, boys were still taught to read and write in Cyrillic script, ensuring the survival of literacy and historical memory. Throughout the centuries of Ottoman rule, sporadic revolts broke out in various parts of Bulgaria. These uprisings were typically localized, disorganized, and quickly suppressed, but they revealed a persistent undercurrent of resistance. The Haiduks, or bandit rebels, became folk heroes in their own right. Operating in the forests and mountains, they attacked Ottoman officials, ambushed tax collectors, and protected villagers from abuses. Although they were often as feared as they were admired, Haiduks played a symbolic role as defenders of the oppressed and reminders of Bulgaria's warrior past. External Christian powers occasionally attempted to stir rebellion or liberate the Balkans from Ottoman control, especially during conflicts between the Ottoman Empire and Austria, Russia, or Poland. Bulgarian hopes were raised on more than one occasion, particularly when Russian armies advanced into the Balkans during the Russo-Turkish Wars. However, these efforts were often focused on the strategic interests of the intervening powers and rarely resulted in lasting change for the Bulgarian population. Despite these challenges, the long centuries of Ottoman rule were not a period of cultural stagnation. Instead, they were marked by quiet endurance, adaptation, and the gradual accumulation of national memory. The foundations laid in this era, preserved through religion, folklore, language, and education, would later become the pillars of the Bulgarian national revival in the 18th and 19th centuries. The story of the Bulgarian Empire, spanning from the 7th century to the 15th, traces one of the most remarkable arcs in the history of southeastern Europe. From its founding by Asparuh in the late 7th century to its zenith under rulers like Simeon the Great and Ivan Asen II, and finally to its fall under Ottoman rule, the empire was more than a political entity. It was a civilizational force that shaped religion, language, law, literature, and identity for millions of people across the Balkans and beyond. Its legacy did not disappear with its territorial defeat. Rather, it endured through memory, faith, and cultural continuity, ultimately becoming a foundation for the modern Bulgarian state. One of the most enduring legacies of the Bulgarian Empire lies in the field of language and literacy. The development of the Glagolitic and later Cyrillic alphabets, spearheaded by the disciples of Saints Cyril and Methodius, and cultivated in Bulgarian centers like Preslav and Ohrid, fundamentally changed the cultural landscape of Eastern Europe. The empire became the first Slavic state to adopt Christianity officially and to develop a Slavic liturgical tradition. This Slavic Christian culture, expressed in Old Church Slavonic and spread through Bulgarian monasteries and literary schools, deeply influenced neighboring peoples, including the Serbs, Russians, and Ukrainians. Even centuries after the political collapse of the empire, this linguistic legacy lived on. The Cyrillic alphabet remains in use today in modern Bulgarian, as well as in Russian, Serbian, Ukrainian, and several other Slavic and non-Slavic languages. Old Church Slavonic, developed and standardized in medieval Bulgaria, became the liturgical language of much of the Orthodox Christian world. Through this legacy, Bulgaria left an intellectual and spiritual imprint on the Orthodox Slavic civilizations. Equally significant was the religious and ecclesiastical foundation built by the Bulgarian Empire. The establishment of an autocephalous Bulgarian church, first as an archbishopric under Boris I and later as a patriarchate under Simeon, set a precedent for national churches within the Orthodox world. This model of spiritual independence from Constantinople, while still remaining within the broader Orthodox tradition, became a vital tool for preserving national identity in later centuries. During the Ottoman period, the Bulgarian church would be suppressed, but its memory and former institutions remained points of reference in the collective consciousness. When the modern Bulgarian Orthodox Church was re-established in the 19th century as part of the National Revival movement, it drew directly upon the legacy of the medieval patriarchate. Its leaders invoked the authority of Patriarch Euthymius of Turnovo, the monastic traditions of Rila and Bashkovo, and the literary contributions of the Preslav and Turnovo schools. The church became not just a spiritual institution but a symbol of historical continuity. Another critical aspect of the Bulgarian Empire's legacy is the preservation of a national historical narrative. Even under centuries of foreign rule, the story of Bulgaria's imperial past was kept alive in chronicles, monastic records, oral traditions, and folk songs. Stories of Tsar Simeon's battles with Byzantium, of Tsar Samuel's defiance, and of Ivan Shishman's last stand against the Ottomans were passed down with reverence. These tales, often mythologized, formed the bedrock of national identity during the Bulgarian national revival. In the 18th and 19th centuries, when nationalist movements swept across the Balkans and Europe, Bulgarian intellectuals and revolutionaries found inspiration in the memory of the empire. Figures such as Paisius of Hilandar, who wrote the famous Slav-Bulgarian history in the latter half of the 18th century, consciously revived the image of medieval Bulgaria to rally the people toward cultural and political awakening. His work, circulated widely in manuscript form, emphasized that the Bulgarians were not merely Ottoman subjects, but heirs to a proud imperial tradition. This sense of historical inheritance fueled efforts in education, literature, and ultimately politics. In towns and villages, Bulgarian schools began teaching national history alongside language and religion. These schools, often sponsored by local communities and merchant families, became breeding grounds for a new generation of Bulgarians who saw their past as a source of future strength. When calls for autonomy and independence gained momentum in the 19th century, they were grounded in the belief that Bulgaria had once been free and great, and could be again. The re-establishment of the Bulgarian state in the late 19th century, following the Russo-Turkish War and the Treaty of San Stefano, was seen by many as a restoration, not merely a creation. The newly autonomous principality and, later, the fully independent Kingdom of Bulgaria adopted symbols, names, and ideals drawn from the medieval past. The names of cities, saints, czars, and military victories from the First and Second Bulgarian empires appeared in public discourse, national literature, and state ceremonies. Even today, the memory of the Bulgarian Empire plays a powerful role in Bulgarian national identity. Statues and monuments commemorate medieval rulers like Asparuh, Simeon, and Ivan Asen. Streets and schools bear their names. National holidays, such as the Day of the Bulgarian Alphabet and Culture, celebrate the legacy of Saints Cyril and Methodius and their disciples. The medieval fortress of Zarovets in Turnovo, once the seat of imperial power, has been restored and serves as a prominent symbol of national pride. Historians, too, continue to study and debate the complexities of the Bulgarian Empire's development, from its Turkic roots to its Slavic synthesis, from its Christianization to its resistance against external domination. Academic work has increasingly focused on understanding the empire's role as both a recipient and a transmitter of Byzantine, Slavic, and steppe influences. This nuanced view has replaced older, purely heroic or tragic interpretations with a richer understanding of Bulgaria's place in European and world history. Beyond Bulgaria's borders, the empire's legacy continues to be acknowledged in the broader context of Orthodox Christianity and Slavic cultural development. It is recognized as one of the earliest and most influential Slavic states, instrumental in shaping the religious and literary paths of Eastern Europe. Its contributions to liturgy, education, and church architecture continue to inspire scholars and clergy alike. The Bulgarian Empire, then, is not simply a chapter in medieval history. It is a cultural inheritance, a reservoir of identity, and a source of inspiration. From the shores of the Danube to the hills of Turnovo, from the golden domes of Preslav to the monastic cells of Rila, the traces of the empire live on. Its rise and fall reflect not only the shifting tides of power in the Balkans, but also the enduring human capacity to build, to believe, and to remember. As modern Bulgaria continues to evolve within a globalized world, the lessons and legacy of its imperial past remain vital. They remind the nation of its resilience, its creativity, and its role in a broader historical tapestry, a tapestry woven through faith, language, struggle, and vision. This concludes the story of the Bulgarian Empire, from its origins in migration and conquest to its legacy in memory and revival. It is a story of triumph and tragedy, of faith and defiance, of forgotten kings and remembered saints. And most of all, it is a story still carried in the hearts and minds of the Bulgarian people.